Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into a world you may have never imagined. Medieval life without privacy. Especially the kind of privacy you definitely want when things got intimate. Imagine a time when bedroom doors didn't exist, your bed was probably shared with at least 3 other people, and even the walls, if there were any, might have been made of fabric. Yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm curious, what city are you listening from, and what time is it over there? Drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and find yourself in a one-room, timber-framed house in a dusty medieval village. There are no doors, not on the front of the house, not on the latrine, and certainly not between the sleeping and cooking spaces. Everything is open, and instead of rooms, there are zones, areas divided by use, not by privacy. You can smell boiling cabbage. You hear the clatter of wood bowls being stacked. And directly in front of you there's a pile of straw and wool blankets that passes as a bed. This isn't some rare peasant misfortune. This is standard housing for 90% of the population. Even if you're doing relatively well for yourself, maybe as a town tanner or blacksmith, your house still probably has just one central living area, with everyone, yes, everyone, sleeping, cooking, arguing, and, well, doing the other thing all in the same space. At night you lie down on the shared mattress, maybe with your spouse, your kids, your apprentice, and possibly even a visiting cousin. There's no curtain to pull. The best you might get is a heavy wool drape separating your corner from the fireplace. If you're lucky, you might position your feet in a different direction from the others, just to create the illusion of boundaries. But there's no privacy, just layers of exhaustion and unspoken etiquette. Want to get frisky? Good luck! You wait until the wheezing snore of your neighbour signals deep sleep. You try to be quiet. You try not to wake the toddler who'll definitely start crying again in 20 minutes. Of course, some households go with the old-fashioned blanket tent. You grab your coverlet, drape it over a chair or a stool, and form a tiny triangle of false seclusion. It's cosy. It's awkward. It's also maybe the most romantic thing you'll get. Soft whispers, quick movements, and always the danger of someone shifting in the straw just a few feet away and grunting, "I can still hear you." Now don't get it twisted, people still had sex, and often. Medieval folks weren't magically less libidinous than we are today, but context was everything. You weren't allowed to pretend you had your own world. You were surrounded by community, family, and obligation. Everyone saw, heard, and probably gossiped. If you were of slightly higher status, say a yeoman farmer or a minor guild leader, you might get a bed with its own curtains. Not a separate room, but a 4-poster frame with fabric you could pull around you at night. These bed curtains served a few purposes. They trapped body heat, blocked out light, and muffled sound slightly. It was like camping with sheets instead of tents, and the campsite was still smack in the middle of your living space. And in castles and manors, the situation shifted only slightly. Yes, there were more rooms, but they weren't private by modern standards. Servants were always present. People walked through chambers to get to other parts of the castle. The lord and lady's bed might be in a separate area, but it wasn't locked. You didn't knock to enter. You just entered. Imagine trying to be discreet when your valet is 2 feet away, lighting a candle or folding your tunic. It's easy to laugh at the idea now, but think about what that kind of daily exposure does to a society's sense of intimacy. When there's no private space, boundaries are drawn socially, not architecturally. People learn to avert their gaze, to pretend not to hear. Children grew up understanding that certain sounds at night were not to be discussed. It was a kind of agreed-upon amnesia baked into community life. You saw, but you didn't. You heard, but you wouldn't dare say. And then there were the architectural quirks. For example, in England and parts of France, some wealthier homes eventually featured solar rooms, upper-floor chambers where the family could retreat. Still not locked, still not sacred, but a step up from the hall downstairs where everyone ate, gathered, and often slept on the floor. Even there, any act of passion was shared with the sounds of snoring retainers below. Scholars still debate just how normalised this lack of privacy was. Some argue that medieval people simply had a different threshold for what counted as personal space. Others insist that people crave privacy just as we do today, but were forced to accept its absence as a harsh fact of life. And then there are those who point to monastic life, as we'll explore soon, and say that privacy itself was a kind of moral indulgence, discouraged in the name of communal virtue. What's not up for debate is that your life, including your most vulnerable and intimate moments, was on near constant display. Whether in the clamour of a peasant hut, the candle-lit creaks of a roadside inn, or the cold stone chamber of a castle, privacy was a luxury few could even conceptualise, let alone afford. So tonight, as you tuck in under your own roof behind your own door, maybe even in a bed made just for you, take a second to appreciate it. Because if you'd been born 800 years ago, your night might include 3 generations of your family shifting beside you while you try not to make a sound. Romantic, huh? The straw crunches under your elbow as you roll over, still in that same single-room home, but now it's morning. The fire has burned low, and cold seeps into your bones. You're not alone in the bed, of course. On one side, your spouse snores gently. On the other, your youngest child has wedged themselves between your ribs in a damp wool blanket. Across from you, your older children are stretching, yawning, and preparing to start the day. But here's the thing, you didn't fall asleep in a bed built for 2. You fell asleep in a bed built for survival. See, back in medieval times, sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they were about heat. The hearth was the heart of the home, and your bed was the next best place to huddle up and keep warm when winter came crawling in through the cracks. So families stacked together like firewood under whatever textiles they had. Itchy wool, old sacks, sometimes even hay-stuffed tunics laid out flat. You were used to the smell, sweat, feet, wood smoke and cabbage. Romance, maybe. Realism, absolutely. And this wasn't just for kids. Entire families slept together, regardless of age or marital status. You, your spouse, your kids, maybe your aging parents, and even a neighbour's child if their roof had collapsed last week. It was all fair game. That meant every natural human function, from a snoring to, well, the less subtle noises of marital bliss, happened in full surround sound. There were no earbuds, no go to your room. You were always within earshot, always within eyesight, and always within nose range. Try lighting a candle to set the mood when the dog's licking itself at your feet and your 10-year-old is watching from the straw pile. In cities, things could get even cosier. Let's say you're a tradesperson renting a tenement room in medieval London. It's likely one tiny space with a shared bed, or maybe just a shared platform for you and a couple of strangers. People often rented bed space in shifts. You sleep during the night shift, someone else sleeps during the day shift, and if you happen to overlap for a few minutes, well, don't mind the elbows, or the sounds, or the smells. And yet, despite these rather horrifying conditions by modern standards, couples still manage to find time and space to connect. That's the most human part of all of this. Love didn't wait for a king-sized mattress. Desire didn't need silence. You didn't require candlelight or background music. You needed timing. Maybe it was early morning before the kids were awake. Maybe it was during a village feast when everyone was distracted. Maybe it was in the barn, which, to be honest, probably offered more privacy than your house ever did. There's this charming, weirdly intimate phrase from the period, to steal a night together. That's what it was, stolen, borrowed from the cracks between duties and watchful eyes. And it wasn't just romantic partners, servants and apprentices, travellers to chefs and shepherds, all navigated a world where physical closeness was unavoidable, and sometimes even encouraged. But here's where it gets tricky, because when everyone sleeps together, and when modesty isn't enforced by architecture, how do you raise children with any kind of boundary? The answer is, you mostly didn't. Children often witnessed or overheard things long before they were supposed to. There are documented accounts of kids being casually exposed to adult behaviour and just rolling with it. Parents might shush a child or distract them, but the idea of sheltering children from adult intimacy simply didn't align with the realities of survival. At the same time, people did have some modesty rituals. For instance, nightshirts weren't just about comfort. They offered a small shred of dignity. Many people slept in long, heavy linen shirts that covered most of the body. Not sexy, but functional. If things were going to get, let's say, more intimate, those garments had to be quietly adjusted under the covers. And again, the magic word here is quietly. One fringe account tells of a particularly inventive couple who, living in a 2-room cottage with several children, crafted a makeshift barrier by hanging smoked fish between 2 poles. No joke. The kids, repelled by the stench, stayed away, weirdly brilliant and deeply medieval. Of course, not everyone tolerated the lack of privacy. Historical records reveal moments of tension, wives dragging sleeping husbands out to the barn for privacy, or arguments erupting over whose turn it was to use the bed alone. In some wealthier homes, a couple might have access to a separate chamber for a night. In poorer ones, couples sometimes took long walks into the woods, not for romance, but for space. And speaking of debate, scholars still argue whether medieval people even wanted privacy the way we do. Was it something they longed for but accepted as unattainable? Or was it simply a non-concept, something unmissed, because it had never existed? One theory suggests that our modern sense of personal boundaries began forming only in the late Middle Ages, with the rise of more permanent architecture and the shift toward nuclear family life. Before that, community trumped individuality, and your body, your voice, your breath in the dark, it all belonged in part to the household around you. So as you stir in that creaky straw bed, side by side with your entire family, one thing becomes clear. Privacy was a myth. Desire was real. Boundaries were imaginary lines drawn in smoke. And love? Love was resourceful, opportunistic, and strangely patient. Because even in a room full of people, with dogs snoring and babies fussing, two people still found a way to reach for each other beneath the blankets and pretend, if only for a moment, that they were alone in the world. You're on the road now, dust clinging to your boots, the late sun stretching golden across a deeply rutted track. You've been walking for hours, maybe days. Ahead, finally, a flickering light. An inn. Not some charming timber-framed fantasy with feather beds and a stable for your steed. No. This is a squat, smoke-stained building hunched against the wind. A shingle swinging overhead with the faint image of a stag, or maybe a goat. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it promises warmth, food, and a place to rest. But sleep, privacy, you might want to lower your expectations. The door swings open on a room packed shoulder to shoulder with travellers, merchants in stained cloaks, a pair of monks playing dice and probably lying about it, and a woman with a painted mouth eyeing you from beneath her hood. A single hearth blazes in the middle of the room, and the air is thick with sweat, smoke, and the unmistakable scent of wet wool. The innkeeper waves you toward the back where the sleeping area begins and ends. It's just a raised wooden platform running the length of the room, already crowded with the shifting, snoring, murmuring bodies of strangers. You wedge yourself between a barrel-chested mason and a toothless shepherd who talks in his sleep. No pillow, just your arm. No covers, unless you brought your own. And as the room quiets, something becomes very clear. You're not alone, and you're never alone. To your right, someone is whispering sweetly, and then, not so sweetly, giggles follow. A sharp squeak of wood. Somewhere someone moans, whether from pleasure or leg cramps, it's hard to say. Medieval inns were notorious for their lack of privacy. Even the better ones, with individual rooms, often rented beds by the half. Yes, you could literally pay for half a bed and share the other half with a stranger. Wealthy travellers sometimes brought their own servants to keep a physical buffer between them and anyone else. Human body pillows with daggers at the ready. But if you were poor or middle class, your night's sleep came with a side of groaning, shuffling, and occasionally full-blown, audible sex happening within arm's reach. Innkeepers usually turned a blind eye. After all, they weren't running monasteries, they were running businesses, and selling warm food, strong ale, and access to a real bed, even a shared one, was lucrative. What people did once the candles were blown out wasn't really their concern, unless things got loud or violent or deeply, deeply strange. One famous traveller from the 14th century grumbled about having to listen to a Cartwright's whore yelp like a cat in heat all through the night. That's a direct quote, scribbled in a journal and somehow preserved, which means it bothered him enough to write it down with ink and a feather in the dark. And that honestly tells you all you need to know about the standard experience. There were no keys, no do not disturb signs, and if you think sneaking off to a more private corner of the building might offer some respite, think again. Most inns were structurally simple. One large common room, a loft for overflow, maybe a stable out back where desperate couples could vanish behind hay bales. And let's not forget the communal latrine, often a wooden plank over a pit, with just enough space for one person to regret their life choices in cold silence. And yet, against all this, people still chose to get frisky in inns. Sometimes it was passion, sometimes it was business. Sex workers often worked these spaces, blending into the mix of travellers and servants. While the church officially frowned upon it, local authorities generally looked the other way. especially if the inn was popular, or if a few coins passed hands. Inns became not just rest stops, but small, chaotic ecosystems of hunger, exhaustion, and temptation. The absence of privacy didn't deter people, it merely shaped how, when, and with whom they acted. Some travellers were bold, they didn't care who heard. Others were strategic, muffling noises under blankets or faking sleep until the room quieted. A few even struck up whispered pacts with their bedfellows. I'll ignore your business if you ignore mine. That unspoken rule, turn your back, plug your ears, pretend you're asleep, was the closest thing to privacy most people got. And then there are the fringe stories. One notorious English case involved a woman who pretended to be a man in order to bunk with her lover undetected. For months they travelled together, sharing beds in inns without raising suspicion. Only when someone grew curious about the lack of beard shaving did the truth come out. The scandal wasn't just about gender, it was about deceiving the inn's fragile ecosystem of implied consent. That's how tight the social rules were. If people were going to have sex in a room full of strangers, everyone needed to be in on the illusion of ignorance. Scholars still debate how much actual sex happened in these places. Some argue that it was constant, a kind of low-level background hum. Others believe it was rare, stifled by the discomfort and the sheer exhaustion of medieval travel. After all, if you'd just walked 30 miles in muddy boots, maybe your top priority was sleep, not seduction. But the truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. Humans are humans, and where there's a warm body, an open bed, and no better option, nature often finds a way. You roll over again, pulling your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The room smells of ale, smoke, and feet. Someone coughs, and a chicken flutters noisily near the hearth. Somewhere to your left there's a low whisper followed by laughter, and then the rhythmic creak of the boards. You shut your eyes. This is just part of the journey. This is how people lived, loved, and slept, under one roof, on one floor, with nothing but air and the occasional prayer separating their bodies from the ears of everyone around them. You wake up early, the wooden floor of the cloister freezing under your bare feet. Dawn hasn't broken yet, but the chapel bell rings out like a warning. You slip on your robe, your mind still fogged with dreams, and fall into step with the others. Silent, obedient, watchful. You're in a medieval monastery now, a place where privacy doesn't just not exist, but where the very idea of privacy is suspect. Because behind these stone walls, even your thoughts aren't really your own. This is a life stripped of the personal, crafted with intention to suppress the body and its unruly demands. Sexual desire, that's not just frowned upon, it's considered a spiritual infection, a temptation sent by demons, something you're expected to root out, not negotiate with. You're told that every time you so much as imagine a warm touch, a curved body, or a breath against your neck, you've committed a sin. And if you enjoy the thought, that's worse. That's your soul catching fire. Life in a monastery, whether you're a monk, nun, or lay brother, is built on the architecture of exposure. Shared dormitories line the upper floors, rows of identical beds evenly spaced, each one visible from the next. No curtains, no doors, no quiet corners, just long stretches of cold wood and linen, and the watchful eyes of your fellow celibates. If someone so much as shifts oddly under their blanket, it's noticed, murmured about, reported. You don't sleep in solitude, you sleep under surveillance. And yet the very institutions that promoted purity also understood just how inevitable desire was. That's why so much of monastic life is built around fighting it. You rise early, you fast, you work, you pray, you're kept too tired, too hungry, and too sore to think about sex, ideally. But the human brain doesn't follow rules like that, especially not in the middle of the night when your dreams creep in under the covers and you wake with your breath short and your thoughts shamefully vivid. So what do? You confess. You shuffle into the chapel before the bells ring, kneel before the confessor and spill it. Not just what you did, but what you thought. Every image, every flicker of heat, every imagined scenario, described out loud to another human being who's probably had the same dreams and is now judging you with practiced neutrality. You leave absolved, in theory, but not always clean, and certainly not forgotten. There's a famous story from a 13th century convent where the nuns were found to have built a small peephole in the cloister wall to spy on passing soldiers. They were caught, punished and shamed, but not excommunicated. The church understood on some level that suppressing desire didn't make it disappear, it just made it more creative. Of course, nuns and monks were expected to remain virgins for life, but records show a surprising number of incidents across Europe: pregnancies, midnight rendezvous, even full-on affairs between clergy members. One abbess was removed after it was discovered that she had a long-term relationship with a local noblewoman. Another monk confessed to falling in love with his own spiritual mentor and wrote poetic letters filled with guilt and longing, some of which have miraculously survived. The question wasn't whether they broke the rules, it was whether they got caught. That's where the real tension lies. Monastic life operated on a paradox. You were supposed to confess your sins, but also avoid committing them. The problem was, the act of confession created a paper trail, and the church, desperate to keep up appearances, often punished those who were most honest. So you learned to confess just enough to look penitent, but not so much that they locked you in a cell or transferred you to a stricter order. Some orders took it even further. The Cistercians, for example, designed their monasteries with acoustics in mind. Noisy floorboards, echoing chambers, and strategically placed attendants were all part of keeping everyone pure. They believed temptation was sneaky, and the only way to combat it was constant vigilance. Ironically, this obsession with control led to some incredibly detailed manuals about what not to do, which by their very nature give modern historians a fascinating peek into what people were absolutely doing. And here's where we hit a scholarly debate. Some researchers argue that the Church's rigid sexual restrictions actually increased the obsession with sex. By labelling every physical desire as a sin, they elevated it, gave it power. Others say the opposite, that monastic life genuinely offered a way out of the mess and chaos of secular love, providing a kind of peace if you could stomach the loneliness. Both views probably hold truth. For some, celibacy was liberation. For others, it was torment. Let's not forget that monasteries also served as social dumps for unwanted children, especially girls. If you were the third daughter of a noble family with no dowry, you were sent to the nunnery. And once there, your desires were expected to evaporate. No one cared if you fell in love, longed for touch, or hated the vow you were forced to take. You belonged to God now, and if you ever slipped, caught sneaking a kiss behind the abbey wall or gazing too long at the visiting bishop, you faced public humiliation, or worse. Still, cracks always formed. In some convents, nuns used coded embroidery to express forbidden feelings, tucking tiny stitched hearts or initials into altar cloths. Monks, too, scribbled poems in the margins of religious texts, sometimes blending devotion with dangerous affection. One manuscript includes a prayer that morphs halfway through into what is clearly a love letter, with lines like, "Your eyes are the stars that blind me in penance." So here you are, tucked into your narrow wooden bed, hands crossed over your chest as instructed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Your body betrays you with warmth you've been told to despise. Your thoughts drift. You press your lips tight, count the cracks in the stone above you and whisper a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for silence. Just enough quiet to keep your thoughts your own for one more night. Because in this life, privacy doesn't mean being alone. It means being forgotten. And that is the most forbidden pleasure of all. You're standing in a small stone church with a dirt floor, the walls sweating with damp. It smells like old wax and unwashed tunics, and somewhere nearby, someone's baby is wailing with that high-pitched desperation that never gets ignored in small villages. But you're not here to pray, or at least not in the usual way. You're here because you did something last night that needs addressing. You've got your tunic pulled straight, your eyes modestly downcast, and your soul, if not your hair, feeling freshly scrubbed. It's confession day, and what you're about to say is going to make the priest's ears twitch under that hood. In the Middle Ages, sex wasn't just personal, it was publicly regulated through confession. Every act of intimacy, so especially anything spicy or off the missionary menu, had a spiritual price. If you touched the wrong person, or the right person at the wrong time, you owed penance. Sometimes a prayer, sometimes fasting. Occasionally, if things got particularly creative, you might be assigned an entire pilgrimage as punishment. That's right. Walk to Canterbury because of what you did in the barn. Barefoot. You kneel on the cold stone. The priest clears his throat. You begin your confession, mumbling through the shame. You and your spouse, late at night, under the shared blanket, tried something a little different. Something not explicitly stated in the marital rules. Maybe it involved certain angles. Maybe it didn't lead directly to procreation. Maybe you liked it too much. And now you're here, whispering it to a man who probably has a logbook longer than your harvest ledger. One that tracks every moan, gasp and illicit touch from every poor sinner in the parish. Confession wasn't just about wiping the slate clean, it was also surveillance. The church learned everything about everyone through these whispered admissions. Who was sleeping with whom? What they did? How often? With what guilt or worse enjoyment? For example, let's say you confessed to having sex on a holy day. That was a no-no. Friday nights were generally out. Lent? Forget it. Sunday mornings? Sacrilegious. If you did the deed during one of the many feast days, or, God forbid, on Christmas Eve, you were looking at a long string of our fathers and the scorn of the priest who now knows way too much about your bedtime schedule. But the real nightmare came if you confessed to something outside the acceptable bounds of marital sex. Oral intimacy, forbidden. Rear entry, straight to penance. Even position mattered. Missionary was expected. Anything else suggested you were channeling the devil's creativity. One 12th century penitential manual explicitly outlines a scale of punishment based on position, frequency, and enthusiasm. That's right, enthusiasm. If you enjoyed it too much, that was suspicious. Sex was supposed to be for procreation, not pleasure. So if you came in smiling, they knew something had gone wrong, and it didn't stop at acts. Thoughts counted too. If you'd had a vivid dream about the neighbour's daughter or caught yourself enjoying a touch that wasn't entirely marital in intent, you owed penance. Lust was a sin of the heart and imagination, and the confessional was designed to catch it like a net scooping fish from a stormy lake. No privacy, no secrets, just you, your shame, and a priest with too much information. Of course, not every priest took it so seriously. Some were bored, drunk, or just too jaded by the constant trickle of confessions. Others, especially in rural areas, were deeply invested. They kept mental maps of who was sinning how often, and with whom. It was less about spiritual guidance and more about control. Confession gave them leverage, and if you were too honest or confessed something particularly salacious, it might just make the rounds as gossip by the next market day. After all, priests were human too. One particularly juicy fringe story involves a village in Italy where a local priest began blackmailing women after hearing their sexual confessions. When confronted, he claimed it was for their souls, and that their public penance was a necessary humiliation. Eventually the bishop stepped in, but not before several lives and marriages were turned inside out. Sometimes your penance was straightforward. Recite the Psalms, fast for 3 days, avoid marital intimacy for a week, which, let's be honest, was probably welcome after the awkwardness of that confession. But occasionally things got darker. Flagellation, cold baths, forced separation. If your offence was repeated, or if it involved someone other than your spouse, you might be paraded through the town square in a shame collar, a heavy iron loop meant to mark you as spiritually diseased. But here's the wild part. Despite all this control, medieval people didn't stop having sex. They didn't stop fantasizing or experimenting or pushing the boundaries of what was allowed. What they did do was learn to code their actions in acceptable language. A little passion became a brief lapse. A long-term affair was a spiritual confusion, and if the priest was sympathetic or in on the scandal himself, you might be forgiven with nothing more than a warning and a discreet nod. There's still debate among scholars about just how invasive these confessions truly were. Some believe that priests exaggerated their power, and that most people confessed only the safest parts, leaving the real stuff unspoken. Others argue that the very structure of the church encouraged this kind of psychological policing, that it created a cycle where guilt became currency, and privacy was surrendered willingly in exchange for absolution. And in a world where walls were thin, beds were shared, and gossip was a form of entertainment, the confessional booth was one of the few places where your secrets were at least supposed to stay hidden. Supposed to, not guaranteed. You stand, crossing yourself, the priest mumbles your penance, and you exit the church with your head low, hoping your neighbour didn't hear your name whispered behind that curtain. You make your way home, already promising to be more restrained next time, more modest, less loud, but you know deep down that the next time your spouse gives you that look across the fire, you'll be right back here again, whispering through the wall about things too delicious to stop. You find yourself standing in front of a linen-draped altar, watching a priest slowly unfurl a bundle of cloth like it contains a miracle, which technically it does, or so the people believe. The moment feels thick with awe. Some villagers drop to their knees, A few whisper prayers, others just stare wide-eyed at the sheet being laid carefully across the stone. This isn't just any scrap of fabric. This, you're told, is a piece of the bed linen where a saint once slept, and by slept, everyone means died, or bled, or maybe, just maybe, stayed untouched. Because tonight we're not just talking about relics, we're talking about virginity, that shiny, impossible, obsessively guarded concept that medieval people built entire social systems around. In the Middle Ages, a woman's sexual status wasn't just personal, it was political, economic, and borderline magical. Virginity was treated like a relic, a sacred badge of worth. It granted you respect, sometimes sainthood, and in many cases, a better marriage offer. Lose it outside the bounds of wedlock, and you weren't just morally compromised, you were damaged goods. And this wasn't a metaphor. We're talking actual tests, public rumours, and horrifyingly real consequences. Take, for example, the infamous bedsheet test after weddings. In many regions, the morning after a marriage involved displaying the newlyweds' bedsheets to prove consummation. Ideally, you'd find a bloodstain, physical evidence of the bride's virginity being broken. It didn't matter that not every woman bleeds. It didn't matter that pain and injury aren't universal experiences. What mattered was the symbolism. The bride had been pure, and now she was someone's legal, moral, and sexual property. Sometimes these sheets were paraded through the village. Think of it as the worst possible version of Laundry Day. Neighbours peeked, family members smiled proudly, servants gossiped, and if no stain appeared, accusations could fly. Families might demand the marriage be annulled. Women could be dragged to a midwife for a humiliating inspection, where fingers and folk science determined whether or not she'd been tampered with. And if you think this was limited to peasant villages, think again. Among nobles and royals, virginity was a tool of diplomacy. Marriages were arranged specifically because a young woman's chastity could secure alliances. Kings wanted untouched brides to guarantee legitimate heirs. Queens in waiting were guarded obsessively, with female attendants tasked to watch over them, sleep in the same room, and report anything suspicious, like flirtation or giggling, or any smile that lasted longer than 5 seconds. Then there were the saints. Virgin martyrs filled medieval hagiographies, glorified in paintings, chants, and sermons. These were women who supposedly died rather than surrender their purity. Agnes, Cecilia, Lucy, all canonized not for what they did, but for what they refused to do. Their stories always follow a grim pattern. A powerful man wants them, they say tu, he gets violent, they get holier. Chastity becomes their shield and eventually their crown. But here's the fringe fact no one talks about. Many of these saints probably weren't virgins. At least not in the strict modern sense. Some were already widows. Others may have had consensual relationships or survived assaults. But in the medieval imagination, virginity wasn't about anatomy. It was about identity. If you behaved like a virgin, modest, spiritual, untouchable, you could still be counted as one. That's right. Virginity, it turns out, was less about biology and more about vibes. Of course, this doesn't mean women didn't face real consequences for deviating from the ideal. They did. Scorn, exile, forced marriages, even imprisonment in some cases. A woman suspected of being sexually active outside of wedlock could lose everything. Her dowry, her family's favour, her place in the community. And if she became pregnant, that wasn't just scandalous. It was legal trouble. Some towns enforced fines, others enacted physical punishments, and the man, he might walk away with a warning, maybe. Yet amid all this control, some women managed to flip the script. There are records of women claiming mystical virginity, insisting that although they'd given birth, they had done so by divine means. Sound familiar? That's the Mary card. And in a few extreme cases, these claims were believed, especially if the woman was a known visionary or recluse. Scholars still argue whether these cases were desperate lies, genuine delusions, or something more complex, a kind of spiritual negotiation in a world that left women very few options. And then there were the relics. That sheet in the church, it might be sold as a piece of a saint's nightgown, or a drop of virgin's blood, or a sliver of the actual mattress where a holy woman once wept instead of giving in. Pilgrims paid to touch them, to kiss them, to pray beside them. Some believed that contact with these relics could protect them from lust or cure them of temptation. Others just wanted a fertility blessing. Either way, virginity had currency, literal, spiritual, and very often fabricated. The church loved this system. Virginity as virtue made excellent PR. Priests could preach about it. Monks could copy texts about it. Nuns could aspire to it, even while secretly grappling with their own desires, locked behind convent walls. The ideal woman was one who had never been touched, and never wanted to be. Which, if you think about it, isn't just unrealistic. It's erasure of real women, real experiences, real bodies, and yet virginity myths persisted, even among ordinary people. If a young girl disappeared into the woods with a boy, her family might force a marriage before anyone could start whispering. If a wife was suspected of infidelity, she could be subjected to a trial of purity. In some regions, this meant holding a red-hot iron or walking barefoot across burning coals. If she emerged unharmed, she was innocent. If she burned, well, she was lying and deserved what she got. There's still scholarly disagreement over how widespread these practices were. Some historians argue that most women led relatively normal sexual lives. Hidden, yes, but not under constant threat. Others suggest that the pressure was overwhelming, shaping everything from fashion to behaviour to literal bodily movement. How you walked, how you smiled, how you looked at someone, it all mattered, it all sent a message. And so you leave the church, the bed linen relics still displayed behind you, the villagers murmuring about its power. A group of girls walks past, eyes wide, clutching their cloaks tighter. One of them whispers something to the others, and they giggle nervously. You wonder what they've been told, that virginity is fragile, that it's everything, that it's their only real value. Or maybe, just maybe, they've figured out the truth, that the story of purity isn't about what you've done, but about what others believe you haven't. You're walking through a bustling village square, chickens darting between feet, the sharp smell of onions in the air, and someone shouting about turnips being ripe as a widow. It's market day, and people are out in full force, hawking wares, arguing prices, and catching up on the most essential business of all, gossip. In the medieval world, information travels not through letters or official channels, but on breath and rumour. And when it comes to matters of love, lust and bedsheets, absolutely nothing stays secret for long. You buy a crust of bread, trying not to stare as two old women whisper with giddy urgency near the well. They are talking about a couple from 3 huts down. Apparently someone heard them last night. Heard the squeaking, heard the moaning, heard everything. And now half the village knows. That's just how it works. If you live in a place where walls are thin, windows are unglazed, and rooms are shared, your private life isn't yours. It belongs to the soundscape, and the moment it becomes interesting, it belongs to everyone else. Market gossip is where medieval sex lives get digested, repackaged and redistributed. You could be a miller's wife, a blacksmith's daughter, a knight's servant. Doesn't matter. If someone hears something or thinks they heard something, it becomes news. And the juicier it is, the faster it travels. Sometimes gossip is just entertainment, but more often than not, it's a form of social regulation, a way of punishing people when formal laws can't or won't intervene. Imagine a widow in her late 30s, independent, attractive, maybe a little too friendly with the shepherd who passes by her door each morning. Nothing has been proven, but she starts getting side glances, fewer invitations, fewer customers for her eggs and cheese. Then someone starts calling her goody open eyes, and suddenly her name has turned into a cautionary tale. No court ruling, no church edict, just whispered judgment repeated until it sticks. Gossip isn't just noise, it's power. And when the village starts whispering about your sex life, you feel it everywhere. Women might cross the road rather than speak to you. Men might try their luck, assuming you've earned your reputation. Even your children, if you have them, might start being treated differently. That's how deep and sticky reputation runs. For couples, it's just as risky. Imagine your partner isn't exactly discreet. Maybe a tryst in the woods goes on too long, or the wrong person sees a certain smirk during Sunday Mass. Suddenly, someone's husband can't satisfy her, and someone else is poking the pig that ain't his. People might laugh when they say it, but the consequences are sharp. A loss of standing, a lost job, even legal trouble if the rumours spiral into accusations. In many towns, adultery wasn't just a private sin, it was a public offence. And while courts might require some sort of proof, gossip often laid the groundwork. A suspicious neighbour, a servant with a loose tongue, or a baker's apprentice who swears he saw someone sneaking out at dawn could ruin you. The church might get involved, the local bailiff, the town elder, but it all starts with a whisper. Even the church itself used gossip as a tool. Priests often relied on what people said more than what they knew. a woman who missed 3 masses and started dressing better, possibly keeping company with the Reeve, a young man who never courted girls and spent too much time at the forge. Definitely suspicious. Whisper networks filled the gaps that sermons couldn't reach, and once your name was in someone's mouth, it took a miracle to get it out. Of course, sometimes gossip was strategic. People weaponized it. If you wanted to get rid of a rival or sink someone's chance at a good marriage, a well-placed insinuation could do the job. I heard she was already promised to someone else. Or, didn't he spend a little too much time in the priest's garden, if you know what I mean? These weren't always lies, but they didn't have to be. Just a hint of impropriety was enough. But here's the quirky fringe fact. Some people liked being talked about. In a weird way, it made them powerful. A woman with a racier reputation might become the person others secretly sought out for advice or seduction. A man known for his impressively loud household activities might suddenly be more in demand as a labourer, or as something else. Gossip could elevate as well as destroy. It depended on how you wore it. There are even preserved court records where people leaned into the rumours. One woman, accused of adultery by her neighbours, responded by saying, "If they're watching my windows, they must be jealous of what's behind them." That's real. Sharp tongue, sharper reputation. She still got fined, but she left a mark. What scholars continue to debate is how much of this gossip culture served as community policing versus straight-up entertainment. Some argue it kept people in line, reinforcing social norms when institutions couldn't. Others say it was just bored people being bored, using stories as a way to pass time, in a world where distractions were few and juicy details were irresistible. And yet, despite all the risk, people still whispered, still giggled, still watched. Because when you live in a society without privacy, curiosity becomes currency. Everyone wants to know what everyone else is doing and who they're doing it with. And even if they disapprove, they listen. In the square, by the well, behind the bakehouse, at the market stalls with their baskets of leeks and their eyes full of judgment. As you leave the square, bread in hand, and a few rumours heavier, you can't help but feel the invisible web all around you. Threads of speculation, accusation, fascination, spun by people with too much time and just enough imagination. And tonight, as someone settles into bed with their spouse, or someone else's, those threads will grow tighter. Because in the medieval world, even if your door is closed, your reputation never sleeps. You're sitting on a low wooden bench, the smell of candle wax thick in the air, waiting for the priest to finish scolding the couple ahead of you. You can't hear every word, but it's clear enough, something about the improper rhythm of marital union and the sacred calendar of abstinence. And now it's your turn. You shift uncomfortably, trying to remember if last night's little moment of intimacy happened too close to a feast day, or during Lent, or, God forbid, on a Sunday. Because here's the truth. In the medieval world, when you had sex mattered almost as much as who you had it with. The church didn't just want to monitor your behaviour, it wanted to schedule it. It's hard to overstate just how many rules the church developed around sex. It wasn't just about sinning or not sinning. It was about following a celestial timetable. There were holy days, saints' days, fast days, feast days, vigils, ember days, and all the long weeks of Lent and Advent, all of which were off limits for marital relations. That left surprisingly few days where couples could engage in intimacy without incurring some degree of spiritual concern. Let's break it down. The church forbade sex on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Why? Wednesday for Judas's betrayal, Friday for the crucifixion, Sunday for the resurrection. Now toss in all the major holidays, Christmas, Easter, and dozens of saints' feasts, and you've got a year in which, if you followed the rules strictly, sex was permitted on fewer than half the nights. And that's assuming your partner wasn't menstruating or pregnant, which also put a halt on things, or that one of you hadn't just received communion, or had an argument, or was feeling a little too lustful. You begin to see how this got complicated. The church wasn't just being uptight. It genuinely believed that sex, even within marriage, had to be managed carefully to protect the soul. Pleasure wasn't the point. In fact, pleasure was suspicious. The ideal sex act, according to many theologians, was brief, sober, and directed toward procreation. Anything more was at best a lapse. At worst, an invitation for demonic interference. That's right, demonic. There was a widely held belief that lust opened the door to sin. Literally. that during particularly intense moments, demons could slip into your soul or even into your womb. One preacher claimed that a child conceived during your unholy copulation was more prone to heresy or deformity. Another warned that couples who moaned too loudly might attract Satan himself, who was said to prowl like a wolf near the beds of the immodest. No pressure, but people, being people, didn't always follow the schedule. That's where the loopholes came in. Confession was one way to smooth things over. You'd admit to the priest that yes, you gave in to temptation on the eve of St. Hildegard's feast, and no, you weren't trying to mock her legacy, you just forgot. Or maybe you'd claim ignorance. It wasn't in your calendar. No one mentioned the fast. Besides, it had been a long week. You needed a little comfort, and sometimes priests were forgiving. They'd nod sympathetically, assign a few prayers, and move on. But not always. Some got picky. They wanted details. They wanted to know if the act was prolonged, if it involved any extra gestures, if both parties seemed to, well, enjoy themselves. Because that too could warrant penance, especially if a woman expressed too much desire. Female pleasure was often viewed with a mix of fear and fascination. It was considered unruly, dangerous, something to be tamped down rather than celebrated. One particularly dramatic cleric in 13th century Paris wrote that a woman who enjoyed sex too much ignites the flame of the pit and endangers the soul of her husband. That's right. Not only was she in trouble, she might drag him down with her. And if you're thinking that seems wildly unfair, you're right. But fairness wasn't the point. Control was. By defining when and how sex was acceptable, the Church positioned itself as the gatekeeper of not just your salvation, but your marriage. Couples needed guidance, approval, permission, and by tying intimacy to the liturgical calendar, the Church extended its influence into the very sheets of your home. There's a quirky fringe document from the 11th century known as the Penitential of Burchard of Worms. It reads like a medieval sex manual written by someone deeply uncomfortable with the human body. It includes a list of sexual sins ranked by severity and prescribed punishments. Some are surprisingly specific. If a man has known his wife in the night before receiving the Eucharist, let him do penance for 1 week. Others are just bewildering. If a man kisses his wife's breast with excessive delight, let him fast for 3 days on bread and water. 3 days for a kiss on his own wife. Welcome to the Morality Olympics. Scholars still argue how strictly these rules were enforced. Some believe they were idealized standards, rarely followed to the letter. Others suggest that in certain communities, especially rural ones where the priest was more feared than respected, these laws shaped everyday behaviour. And there are even cases where overzealous clergy were reported for poking too far into people's bedrooms, asking invasive questions, or publicly shaming couples during Mass. But enforcement aside, the rules had an impact. Couples internalised them. Young people grew up hearing about them. And over time, the idea that sex was only acceptable under narrow, sterile conditions became deeply embedded. It shaped not just actions, but expectations. Desire became something to control, not to explore. Pleasure became a guilty indulgence, not a shared joy. And yet people still found ways to resist. They broke the rules quietly, behind curtained beds or under the stars. They whispered, touched and loved on days they weren't supposed to. And then they showed up at church, kneeling in pews with innocent faces, pretending they hadn't just defied heaven's calendar. That's the strange duality of the medieval mind, obedient on the outside, wildly human underneath. So as you step out of the church, penance assigned and conscience soothed, you glance up at the sky, trying to remember what saint's day is coming next. Not because you want to honour it, but because you're trying to figure out when exactly you can sleep with your spouse again without technically summoning eternal damnation. And even then, you might just roll the dice anyway. Because medieval life is short, cold, brutal, and sometimes a little warmth under the covers is worth the risk. You slip into the steam, toes first, then legs, letting the heat climb your skin in waves. The bathhouse is alive with sound, splashes, laughter, and the hoarse clink of wooden cups. The scent of rosemary, sweat, and something sour drifts through the thick, damp air. You're naked, of course, so is everyone else. This isn't some private luxury spa tucked away behind guarded gates. This is a public bathhouse, smack in the middle of a medieval city, and for just a few coins, it's yours. for as long as the water stays warm and no one gets too frisky. Or too obvious about it, anyway. In the Middle Ages, especially in parts of Europe like Germany, France and Italy, bathhouses were social hubs, half spa, half community centre. You came to wash, sure, but also to talk, eat, drink, flirt and maybe, just maybe, negotiate a bit of companionship after hours. The line between hygiene and hedonism wasn't always as crisp as the church would have liked, and for a brief window of history, cleanliness and carnality soaked together in the same tub. Bathhouses varied in size and layout. Some were simple, a few steaming wooden tubs, a furnace nearby, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. Others were elaborate, with tiled floors, separate areas for men and women, though those rules were often bent, and private rooms for resting. And if that word sounds suspiciously euphemistic to you, you're not wrong. You settle in, the water lapping against your collarbone, and look around. In one corner, two merchants are playing dice on a floating board. A group of women giggles softly in another pool, a towel or two draped more for modesty's sake than actual coverage. A servant walks by with a tray of warm wine and honey cakes. The atmosphere feels almost civilised. But underneath that surface, calm hums something more electric. Here, among the steam and the bare skin, intimacy is both encouraged and policed. Bathhouses weren't brothels, at least not officially, but they were adjacent. Sex workers often operated nearby or even within the bathhouse, offering extras to clients who knew how to ask. Some bathhouses had upstairs rooms you could rent for an hour, no questions asked. Others didn't even bother pretending. A few had carved symbols on the outside wall, a towel for bathing only, a shoe for something extra. That blending of bathhouse and brothel was controversial, to say the least. The church despised it. Preachers thundered about the sin of washing beside the opposite sex, calling it a gateway to lust and damnation. One German preacher warned that bathhouses were the devil's cauldron, where modesty boils away. Bold words, considering even monks and priests were known to frequent them, sometimes in disguise, sometimes not even bothering to hide. That's part of the contradiction of medieval life. The same society that demanded sexual restraint also built these steamy sanctuaries of sensual chaos. It wasn't just about the body. It was about class, status, and the illusion of control. Nobles might have private tubs brought into their homes, but even they showed up at public bathhouses to show off silk towels and scented oils. Bathing was a chance to display wealth as much as it was to scrub away filth. And make no mistake, people were filthy. Most roads were unpaved, shoes were thin, and livestock shared the streets. Getting clean was necessary, and if it happened to include a flirtatious rinse with the baker's wife, well, you were already here, weren't you? Bathhouses were also where rumours flowed almost as freely as the water. Naked bodies meant naked truths. People let down their guard in the heat, talked too much, laughed too loud. Secrets soaked into the steam. Affairs were hinted at, debts discussed. Sometimes even confessions whispered. And always there were eyes, watching, measuring, deciding if what you were doing was just friendly, or about to earn you a midnight visit from a very annoyed spouse, or the town constable. But let's not get too romantic. These weren't magical utopias of equal pleasure. Bathhouses could be dangerous, especially for women. Flirtation could turn to pressure, consent blurred. And while some bathhouses operated with clear rules and even hired attendants to maintain order, others descended into places of exploitation. There's a fringe account from a bathhouse in Prague where a bather fell asleep in one of the resting rooms and awoke to find his purse and his clothes gone. He walked home naked in the snow. No one was surprised. Everyone assumed he'd paid for more than a bath and gotten exactly what he deserved. Still, despite the church's growing panic, bathhouses flourished until they didn't. With the rise of plague and fear of disease, public bathing began to fall out of favour. People worried that heat opened the pores to infection, that touching shared water meant touching death. By the 16th century, many bathhouses were closed or repurposed, transformed into taverns, boarding houses, or storage barns. The age of shared steam faded, replaced by suspicion and the slow rise of home bathing. Privacy, cleanliness, and sex began to separate again. But for a few hundred years they soaked together quite comfortably. Scholars still debate how widespread the erotic side of bathhouses really was. Some argue that most people were just there to get clean, maybe with a bit of casual conversation. Others point to city records, complaints and morality sermons as proof that bathhouses were hotbeds of temptation. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle. Like so much in the medieval world, bathhouses were a place of contradictions. Healing and harm, modesty and indulgence, virtue and vice. You stand, water pouring off your skin, and reach for the rough towel hanging on the peg. As you dry off, the servant offers you another cup of wine. You sip, nod, and try not to glance too long at the figure stepping into the pool you just left. A familiar face, smiling just a little too knowingly. Maybe you'll stay for one more round. Maybe not. After all, the water's still warm, and the night is still young. You're standing in the centre of a crowded village, flowers underfoot, bread in your stomach, and music twanging out from somewhere behind the crowd of dancers. It's wedding day, and the whole town has turned out, not just to celebrate, but to witness. Because in the Middle Ages, a wedding isn't a private moment between two people. It's a public declaration, a legal bond, and a communal event with one final requirement: proof that the marriage has been consummated. That's right. Everyone's here to make sure you don't just get married, you actually do the deed. The celebration starts early. A procession winds through the town with the bride and groom at the front, awkwardly smiling while villagers toss flower petals, breadcrumbs, and the occasional pointed joke their way. The church ceremony is brief, solemn, and very much a contract. There are witnesses, oaths, and a priest reminding everyone that this union is less about love and more about property, bloodlines, and legitimate heirs. But the real ceremony, the one everyone remembers, comes afterward. After the dancing, after the feasting, when the ale has started to warm in people's bellies, the crowd leads the couple to their bed. Literally, that's the ritual, the bedding ceremony. Two people who may barely know each other are walked through the streets, up to the house, and escorted into a room where a marriage isn't truly official until it's been sealed between the sheets. Not metaphorically, legally. Imagine it. You and your new spouse are shoved into a room while your parents, siblings, cousins, and possibly a few nosy neighbours cheer and joke behind you. In some places, the couple is expected to lie in bed while guests sing bawdy songs, throw rice, or offer advice that's more suggestive than helpful. In others, a priest might say a blessing over the marriage bed. Sometimes it's just a chaotic tangle of clapping and teasing, like a medieval version of frat house hazing with more lace and fewer red cups. Then the curtains are drawn, or not. In some regions it's custom to leave them open for a few minutes so the witnesses can confirm that the couple is in bed together. In other traditions, an elder stays just outside the room listening intently. Listening for what exactly? Well, that depends. A bit of movement, a grunt, anything that might indicate the act has begun. If things are especially formal, the sheets may be inspected the next morning. Yes, again with the bloodstains. If they're there, the family beams with pride. If they're not, well, suddenly breakfast gets very quiet. You might wonder why anyone would agree to this, but in the medieval mindset, marriage wasn't just emotional, it was transactional and public. The legitimacy of the union and any future children depended on it being witnessed and confirmed. If a marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. Families had a vested interest in making sure their daughter wasn't abandoned or their son wasn't tricked. And in a world where gossip functioned as both entertainment and legal evidence, the more witnesses, the safer everyone felt. There are even accounts of local lords demanding to see evidence themselves. One lord in 14th century France reportedly required the newlywed couple to present their stained sheets within 24 hours. If they failed, he fined them. A court in northern Italy once ruled that a man owed his bride's family damages because he'd lain beside her in silence and sloth for 3 nights. The case file used those exact words, silence and sloth. But sometimes, couples found ways around the system. If the bride had already lost her virginity, midwives might stage the sheets, adding a few drops of pig's blood, or pricking the inside of the bride's thigh to simulate the expected outcome. Other times they simply bribed the witnesses to report that all was well. As long as no one objected, the fiction held. Still, the pressure to perform on command, often with a room full of people just outside the door, could be overwhelming. Some grooms failed. Whether from nerves, drink, or sheer disbelief that this was actually happening, they simply couldn't go through with it. In those cases, the bride was often blamed. Maybe she was too forward. Maybe she was cursed. Maybe she was a witch. Anything but the possibility that the groom was just a guy stuck in a horrifying cultural ritual and desperately trying not to cry. Not all couples dreaded the bedding. Some embraced it literally. For young people who'd been chaperoned their entire lives, this was finally a moment of intimacy. For others, it was a chance to flex a little status. Wealthy families often turned the bedding ceremony into a performance. Fine linens, embroidered nightclothes, gold thread pillows, and enough bystanders to form a legal defence team. The couple would be paraded around the room like prized cattle, each step symbolising their social importance. And that's the heart of it. This wasn't about sex, not really. It was about proving a point, that the marriage was real, that the family name would continue, that no one had been cheated. Which is why the church supported the custom, even if it made people squirm. Public confirmation removed doubt. Doubt led to disputes, and disputes led to lawsuits. Best to get everything out in the open, preferably by candlelight, with your cousin standing outside the door holding a mug of ale and listening for moans. Of course, scholars still debate just how widespread and intense these rituals really were. Some suggest that bedding ceremonies were mostly symbolic, not actually invasive. That the couple was given privacy after the songs were sung. Others point to legal cases, sermons, and etiquette guides that clearly outline the requirement to witness consummation. Like most medieval practices, it varied wildly by region, class, and local tradition. But the idea was consistent. A wedding wasn't real until it was real in bed. And so you find yourself lying beside your brand new spouse, stomach still full from dinner, mind racing, ears picking up every creak and whisper beyond the door. There's a fire in the hearth, and 6 different people waiting just outside to discuss your performance over breakfast. No pressure. You turn to face the person beside you, barely lit by the flicker of the flames, and say nothing. Because whatever happens next, one thing is certain, everyone will know, whether you want them to or not. You're jolted awake in the pitch black of a medieval night, the kind of darkness so complete it feels thick around your face. There's a sound, a thump, maybe a shuffle. You blink into the void, heart thudding, trying to remember where you are. A shared sleeping chamber, cold floorboards beneath, bundled bodies all around. Someone mumbles nearby, then silence. And then it happens again. A loud, unmistakable groan, followed by a rustling of straw and blankets. The room stills, except for a sharp intake of breath, and then a voice, confused, half asleep. "Who's there?" In most households this would be awkward at best, but in some medieval courts this could become a full-blown legal case. Because believe it or not, medieval Europe actually had to deal with a series of accusations involving people committing sexual acts in their sleep, or claiming they did, or claiming someone else did. Welcome to the bizarre, foggy, often hilarious territory of sleep sin in medieval law. It started with a question that still puzzles people today. Can someone be guilty of a sin they didn't know they committed? Medieval theology said yes, kind of, and no, also kind of. But when it came to sex, that debate got murky fast. Let's say a man was accused of sleeping with a woman who wasn't his wife, but swore he was unconscious at the time, perhaps even dreaming of his wife. Is he guilty? What if she says she thought he was someone else? What if neither party is quite sure what happened because they were both asleep? This actually happened, several times. There's a documented case in 14th century England where a man named Willem was accused by his neighbour's daughter of getting into the wrong bed after too many tankards of ale. She claimed he was in his cups, crawled into her straw pile, and began the work of husband and wife. He claimed he thought she was his wife. In the same room, same bed layout, same wool blanket. Honest mistake? The local court didn't think so. He was fined and made to stand in the churchyard wearing nothing but his under tunic while holding a candle the size of a baby goat. A kind of visual apology to the town and to God. But what's more interesting is that the case hinged not just on what he did, but what he was aware of while doing it. The idea that one could commit carnal sin without full waking intent became a serious theological debate. Then there's the flip side, people claiming to have been seduced or assaulted while they slept. These cases were more dangerous, especially for women. Imagine waking up with a body beside you that shouldn't be there. You might be believed, or you might be laughed out of sad town. If you weren't a virgin, or if you had a previous flirtation with the accused, people might assume you invited it. Some courts required corroboration, a witness, a physical sign, a scream. But if the act happened quietly under the cover of shared sleep, what then? Medieval law didn't have a uniform answer. In some places these cases were dismissed as misunderstandings. In others, they turned brutal with lashings or even exile. Much depended on status, family connections, and how convincingly you could recount your side of the story in front of a room full of men in itchy wool robes. There's one particularly weird story, undoubtedly fringe, about a nun in 15th century Germany who claimed she had been repeatedly visited at night by what she believed was an angel. The angel, she said, came while she was asleep, kissed her hands, and eventually began touching her in a manner most unheavenly. When pressed, she insisted it wasn't a demon, because he smelled like lilies and didn't speak. The abbess believed her. A bishop did not. Eventually, it was ruled that the nun had fallen into spiritual confusion brought on by impure dreams. She was reassigned to a quieter convent, and the case was buried, literally. The records were found centuries later, written in a margin beside a psalm about temptation. And this opens a question still debated by scholars. Did medieval people see dreams as morally dangerous? The answer is yes, at least partially. Dreams were thought to be gateways, not just to the subconscious, but to the soul. They could be influenced by divine forces, yes, but also by demons. Lustful dreams surely were feared. If you awoke from a vivid encounter and felt a certain dampness, you were expected to confess it, even though it had happened in sleep. Because if your body responded, the sin was considered halfway real. Some penitential manuals even describe procedures for dream pollution, assigning penance to monks and laypeople alike who found themselves affected by the nighttime arousal. The remedy? Cold baths, fasting, extra prayer, and absolutely no sleeping on soft surfaces for at least a week. A kind of medieval reboot. Hit reset on your libido with ice water and guilt. Of course, not everyone took this seriously. In some circles, dream sex was laughed off, especially when told with enough flair at the tavern. Better a dream wife than none at all, Odman, one drunken tailor reportedly quipped, according to a scribbled note in a 14th century city log. But in households with thin walls, many ears, and a strong belief in both demons and legal consequences, even accidental intimacy could become public scandal. You roll over in the darkness, wondering what your twitchy leg and that odd dream about the village miller might mean. You're not guilty, right? It was just a dream. A weird, awkward, slightly hot dream. You say nothing, still as a statue, willing your body to calm down and your mind to stop imagining the worst, because you know how fast a whispered accusation can turn into a ruined life. And tomorrow morning someone might remember hearing a sound, a creak, a moan, a name muttered into the night. And that's all it takes. In a world where privacy is smoke and sin floats like pollen in the air, even your dreams can be held against you. You're creeping through the stone corridors of a castle now, boots quiet on the rush-covered floor, hand brushing the chill of the wall. The torches flicker low, just enough to cast golden shadows, and their air smells faintly of beeswax, roast venison, and damped wool. It's late. The halls are mostly silent, and somewhere in the distance you can hear the soft breathing of guards posted at the gate. You pause outside a chamber door listening, not for the sounds of danger, but for something else entirely, because in this castle even love has an audience. Being a noble in the medieval world had its perks, feasts, furs, falconry, but privacy? Not so much, especially not in bed. That grand canopy bed with its velvet hangings and gilded posts, probably surrounded by a small army of attendants, pages, maids, squires, and the occasional court fool asleep in a chair. Those heavy drapes weren't just for drama, they were your last and only barrier between your body and a room full of people who were absolutely going to hear everything. If you were lucky, you might get a few moments alone with your lover. If you were married, that time might be scheduled, like an awkward royal appointment. Tomorrow after prayers and before the midday meal, yes, that'll work. Even kings and queens weren't exempt. Servants were constantly present, helping them dress, bathe, eat, and occasionally undress. There are actual records of noble couples being undressed for bed by attendants who then remained in the room, just outside the curtains, through the night. And these weren't just random onlookers. In many cases, they were family retainers, handpicked to ensure the proper order of things was followed. That meant making sure the couple actually shared the bed, that no one else slipped in, that the correct heir could later be claimed without dispute. The medieval aristocracy lived under constant observation, sexuality included. Imagine being a teenage princess married off to a foreign prince, barely understanding the language, and then expected to produce heirs within the year, all while two aging handmaids watch your every move with cold efficiency. It's not just stressful, it's humiliating. And yet it was the norm. because for the upper classes, sex was never just about pleasure. It was about legacy. Let's say you're a baron trying to consolidate power through your marriage. The consummation of that union isn't just a personal milestone, it's a political act. If you fail to perform, it becomes a matter of public concern. There are historical cases, well documented, where kings had to prove their virility by discussing or demonstrating their sexual capabilities in front of witnesses. Louis XVI of France, several centuries later, famously failed to consummate his marriage for 7 years, prompting medical consultations, public mockery, and even diplomatic worry. Back in the medieval period, the scrutiny could be just as intense, if more localised. One nobleman was reportedly so terrified of failing in front of his ever-present servants that he fled his own bedchamber and attempted to elope with a kitchen maid, hoping for a less judgmental audience. Spoiler, it didn't go well. He was caught, excommunicated, and lost half his land, and of course the presence of all those servants created opportunities, sometimes accidental, sometimes strategic, for secrets to leak. A chambermaid might overhear too much and start whispering in the laundry room. A squire might witness a noblewoman kissing someone other than her husband, and later use that knowledge to blackmail her for gold or favours or protection. And some nobles used their staff as intermediaries, sending coded messages, arranging meetings, or even standing guard during illicit rendezvous. Intrigue was currency, and castles were crawling with it. That brings us to a fringe fact that rarely gets mentioned. In certain households, noble women of high status trained their servants in discretion, not just in etiquette, but in the delicate art of not noticing. One particularly bold duchess in the Low Countries reportedly gave her maids a list of acceptable noises to ignore and unacceptable topics to repeat. Any violation meant immediate dismissal, or worse, confinement. Because in a world without privacy, your only defence was loyalty, purchased carefully and kept close. Scholars still debate whether noblewomen had more or less sexual freedom than their lower-class counterparts. On the one hand, they were surveilled relentlessly. Every move, every glance, every pregnancy carried political weight. But on the other, they had resources, rooms, servants, money that allowed them to carve out small pockets of autonomy. Some used their influence to form quiet relationships. Others played the game strategically, aligning themselves with powerful lovers to gain protection or favour. And then there were the scandalous ones, the ones who defied all rules, dared to love publicly and paid dearly. Take the infamous case of Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France, accused, falsely or not, of having affairs with several nobles, one of whom was murdered in suspiciously opportune timing. Or Eleanor of Aquitaine, who took lovers, led armies, and at one point was locked in a castle for nearly 15 years by her husband, King Henry II. Not for infidelity, technically, but definitely for being inconvenient. Still, for every known scandal, there were a dozen quiet stories, tales of letters exchanged behind tapestries, night-time visits, facilitated by bribed servants, secret pregnancies hidden beneath layers of velvet. Nobles, just like peasants, found ways to pursue desire, despite the walls, the ears, and the consequences. But they did it in rooms lined with portraits, beneath ceilings painted with angels, and on beds so massive they echoed. So here you are, behind the drawn curtains of a noble bed, the fire dying low in the corner, the sounds of breathing and shifting armour just beyond the silk. You reach for the hand beside you, soft and tentative. There's no whispering, no laughter, just the silent understanding that even this, even now, is being listened to. And still you choose closeness. Because love, real or strategic, demands risk. Even when the servants are still awake. You're lingering in a castle corridor just before twilight, watching as the household shifts from its daytime rhythm to the quiet, candlelit buzz of evening. The fire's been stoked, the doors bolted, and dinner cleared, but no one's retiring just yet. There's one more thing left to do: gather in the hall and listen to a tale of courtly love, that peculiar, aching kind of romance medieval aristocrats were obsessed with. It's poetry recited beside the hearth, a knight's longing stare across the banquet table, a lady sighing dramatically from a window. But here's the catch. Courtly love flourished in a world where privacy barely existed. So how exactly do you pine for someone with everyone watching? It starts with an idea, not a kiss. A glance, a gesture, the soft exchange of a glove, the slip of a note folded with trembling hands and sealed with a dab of wax. These small coded moments between noblemen and women didn't require secrecy in the modern sense. In fact, they relied on being witnessed. That's what gave them power. Everyone in the castle saw it. The lingering glance, the flushed cheek, the too formal bow, and they all whispered, because this was love as theatre, passion built to be admired from the sidelines. You've probably heard of courtly love in connection with knights and ladies, the stuff of troubadour songs and dusty romance tales, but the real thing was a little messier. It was built on distance, on yearning, and on the impossibility of fulfilment. Courtly love thrived in the tension between desire and restraint. The knight falls in love with a lady he can never touch. She's married, highborn, unreachable. He writes songs about her eyes. She gives him a handkerchief. He carries it into the battle, nearly dies, and returns just to lay it at her feet. They might never kiss. They're not supposed to. That's the point. But in practice, people were absolutely making out behind tapestries. While the ideal of courtly love was chaste, the reality often wasn't. These castles were pressure cookers, crammed with people, expectations and forced proximity. Everyone watched everyone else, and yet somehow romance bloomed in all the cracks, whispered confessions in the chapel gallery, secret hand-holding under the banquet table, rendezvous in the garden maze. Yes, there were always eyes nearby. But half the thrill was knowing how to evade them. Still, actual privacy was nearly impossible. The noble lady had her maids. The knight shared quarters with other squires. Even the corridors echoed with footsteps at all hours. Lovers had to be clever. They used music as a distraction, parties as camouflage. One noblewoman, according to a rather colourful account in a 14th century Italian diary, arranged her daily embroidery sessions near a strategic window. Her lover, a poet, would deliver song from the courtyard below. The lyrics weren't subtle, but as long as no one said anything, everyone could pretend nothing was happening. The game was always one of implication, never admission. That's not to say things never got scandalous. Oh, they did. Entire epics were written about adulterous affairs. Think Tristan and Isolde, or Lancelot and Guinevere. These weren't cautionary tales so much as fantasies of forbidden love, dressed up in moral language to make them palatable, but they resonated because they mirrored the lives people were already living. Emotional affairs, secret loyalties, the painful knowledge that the person you longed for was always just out of reach, and possibly sleeping 3 rooms over with their perfectly respectable, perfectly boring spouse. Some castles even had lovers' stairs, small discreet staircases that led from the ladies' chambers down into the garden or chapel, ostensibly for pious midnight prayer or a breath of fresh air. But everyone knew better. These weren't secrets, they were traditions. And then there were the love tokens. These were more than just sentimental gifts. They were symbols of an unspoken bond. A scarf, a carved brooch, a lock of hair wrapped in parchment. Wearing such a token publicly was a statement, subtle but pointed. Knights would fasten them to their tunics before jousts or battles. Ladies would press them into letters, scented with crushed lavender or rose petals. These tokens weren't hidden away in drawers, they were displayed. The whole castle saw, and no one dared to speak. There's a curious fringe case out of Burgundy involving a knight who carried a lady's slipper on his belt for 2 years straight. When asked why, he simply replied, "Her foot still haunts me." No one knows what became of the lady, or the shoe, but somewhere in a French archive there's a doodle of a slipper surrounded by hearts in the margin of a knight's travel journal. So yes, romance was alive even if it wore muddy boots and never quite found a private corner. Scholars argue about whether courtly love ever existed as an actual practice or was just a literary ideal. Some insist it was a game, a performance of emotion designed to elevate women and civilize warriors. Others claim it was a deeply felt cultural code, one that allowed men and women to engage in affection within strict social boundaries. Still others say it was just a fantasy, a way to distract people from the brutal, pragmatic reality of medieval marriage, which was more about land than love. But in a world with no bedrooms of your own, no secrets that stayed secret for long, and no locks on the chamber door, courtly love offered something priceless. The illusion of privacy. A shared glance no one could take away, a gesture only 2 people truly understood. And in that illusion, people found something real, something that made all the watching eyes, the constant supervision, and the ever-present gossip bearable. So tonight, as the harpist strums his final chord and the hall grows quiet, you catch sight of 2 people across the room. One noblewoman, eyes fixed on her embroidery. One knight, hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. They don't speak, but the message is clear. In the flicker of the firelight, in the knowing silence, there's a story being written. No ink, no paper, just a love that burns quietly, invisibly, right in front of everyone. You're standing in a small candle-lit room that smells like crushed herbs and damp linen, watching a woman lie still on a wooden table. Around her, 3 midwives move with quiet purpose, one checking her belly, one watching her face, and one preparing a length of cloth. It should be a moment of care, a routine examination in a world where pregnancy is as common as rain. But there's tension in the room, an almost physical pressure that sits on your chest. This isn't just a checkup, this is an investigation. Because someone, somewhere, has accused her of not being a virgin, and now her body has become evidence in a public, humiliating trial by midwife. It's hard to overstate just how much weight the female body carried in medieval society, not just physically, through childbirth and labour, but symbolically. A woman's reputation often hinged entirely on whether or not she'd kept herself, and once that status was questioned, proving or disproving it became a matter of the intense, invasive scrutiny. The church, the law, and the local community all had a vested interest in controlling women's sexuality, and the midwife, she was the one left to do the dirty work. Midwives were powerful figures. They weren't just birthing specialists. They were unofficial doctors, herbalists, spiritual counsellors, and sometimes legal witnesses. Trained by experience more than textbooks, they knew how to read bodies the way others read scripture, which made them both respected and feared. If a girl was suspected of secret intimacy, maybe her belly had grown a little rounder, or someone spotted her crying in the churchyard. She could be summoned to one of these secretive exams. The goal? To determine whether her body still bore the marks of virginity. Of course, the idea that virginity has a clear physical sign is pure fiction. But in the Middle Ages, belief often trumped biology. Midwives would check for signs, a tightness, a certain freshness of flesh, a resistance to touch. They'd question the girl, sometimes gently, sometimes not. Do you bleed when you pass water? One might ask. Have you ridden horses, climbed trees, taken a fall? Anything could be twisted into evidence, either of innocence or guilt. In rare cases, more invasive procedures were performed. With no medical instruments, no anaesthesia, and no understanding of consent in the modern sense, these exams were as much theatre as science. If the woman was found to be a virgin, by whatever murky standard was applied, she was cleared. If not, things could spiral fast. She might be forced into marriage with the alleged partner, or shamed, or locked in a small cell to reflect, and in the worst cases, punished for dishonouring her family or deceiving a man of higher rank. There's a chilling record from a town in northern Spain where a young woman, accused of breaking her marriage contract, was subjected to a midwife's examination in front of witnesses, including her future mother-in-law. The midwife claimed to find looseness and wear, vague, unprovable terms. The marriage was cancelled. The woman was labelled impure. She lived the rest of her life in service to a convent that didn't want her, but took her in out of pity. Her name was struck from local records, but the accusation, that lived on in whispered stories for decades. Still, midwives weren't always villains. Many sympathised with the women they examined. They knew better than most that the so-called tests were subjective, and that they often found subtle ways to protect the accused. She seems intact, they'd say, regardless of what they saw, likely just swollen from the heat. Too thin for childbearing, definitely untouched. These carefully chosen phrases could make or break a life. And in some communities, midwives worked quietly to shield women from harsher consequences, especially if they were poor, unmarried, or unlucky enough to have been seduced and abandoned. There's even a fringe tale about a midwife in 13th century Florence who developed a secret technique to simulate virginity, something involving goose fat, beeswax, and stitched linen. Was it true? Maybe, maybe not. But the fact that such rumours existed shows just how desperate people were to pass these tests, and how creative midwives could be when navigating the brutal system they were part of. Scholars still wrestle with the historical accuracy of these examinations. Some argue that they were rare, symbolic gestures, rather than common practice. Others insist they were disturbingly routine, especially in legal disputes, annulments, or rape accusations. The truth, as usual, probably sits in between. We know the records exist. We know the church sometimes required bodily proof. We know women's testimonies were often ignored unless backed by a midwife's word. And that's where the real power lay. The midwife's verdict could lift a woman from scandal or crush her under it. She became a kind of moral gatekeeper, translating bodies into judgments, not because she wanted to necessarily, but because the system demanded it. And in a world where privacy was non-existent, the female body became a public battleground. There's a moment in all these stories, quiet, small, but devastating, when the examined woman gathers her clothes, avoids every eye in the room, and walks out into the daylight knowing that people will talk. Whether she was cleared or not, the act of being examined marks her. The whispers follow, the doubt lingers, and she will spend the rest of her life, married or unmarried, fertile or not, trying to outrun a moment that was never hers to control. You leave the room with the midwives behind you, their murmurs soft and unreadable. Outside, the market buzzes. No one looks your way, but you feel the weight of imaginary eyes all the same. Because even if your name isn't on anyone's lips today, you know how fast that can change. All it takes is a rumour, a shadow, a moment alone with the wrong person, and if it comes to it, your body will be the only evidence you have, and it might not speak in your favour. You're huddled beneath your cloak on a windswept hillside, eyes wide in the firelight as a travelling friar spins a story meant to chill the soul, and definitely the loins. The wind howls, sparks rise from the flames like tiny souls trying to flee, and the friar's voice deepens as he warns that Satan himself walks among the lustful, in forms most seductive and unexpected. A woman with eyes too green, a man with a voice like honey, a stranger who appears in your dreams and leaves you breathless by morning. These, he says, are not Pubutha people. They are demons, and they come not to love you, but to claim your body, and then your soul to soul. Welcome to the wonderfully terrifying world of medieval demonology, where sexual temptation didn't just come from within, it came from outside in the form of succubi, incubi, witches, and other conveniently blamable forces. Because if you gave in to a sudden craving, if you touched someone you shouldn't have, or had a night you couldn't explain, it might not be your fault. The devil made you do it. At least that was the hope. Let's start with the incubi and succubi, demons who specialised in sensual temptation. The incubus, male in form, was said to visit women in their sleep, pressing upon their chests, whispering dirty nothings, and doing much more before slipping away like mist. The succubus did the same to men. She might appear as a beautiful maiden, a former lover, or an angelic face surrounded by curls of golden light, until morning, when the man woke exhausted, drained, and often deeply ashamed. These weren't just stories told for fun, people believed them. There are court records, church documents, and medical treatises that take these encounters seriously. If a woman claimed she became pregnant without ever lying with a man, she might insist it was the work of an incubus, and in rare cases, that defence actually worked, especially if she had been considered chaste and pious beforehand. Because what could be more medieval than deciding it was more believable that a demon impregnated you than a local farm boy? The church wrestled with this idea for centuries. Were these demons real? Was the devil truly running a spectral bordello at night, corrupting the faithful one dream at a time? Some theologians said yes. St. Augustine, in fact, warned that incubi were active in the world and that women should guard their dreams with prayers and purity. Others, like Thomas Aquinas, took a more logistical approach. He theorized that incubi collected seed from men and then used succubi to implant it in women, essentially turning demons into middlemen for unauthorized conception. It was biology meets theology with a strong dash of panic. But belief in sexual demons wasn't just about fear, it was about control. Because if the devil could be blamed for illicit desire, then the church had an enemy to fight, a reason to enforce stricter morality and a way to scare people back into chastity. Lust wasn't just a weakness, it was an opening, a crack in your soul that let evil crawl in. And if demons weren't enough, there were always witches. By the late Middle Ages, the figure of the lustful witch had emerged full force. Witches, it was said, copulated with the devil during black masses, brewed aphrodisiacs from toadstools and hedgehog hearts, and cast spells to make virtuous men fall into depravity. A man who strayed from his marriage might blame a cursed stew. A woman caught in adultery might claim she'd been bewitched by a glance, or by touching a charm tucked into her mattress. There's a disturbing fringe case from Switzerland in which a woman was accused of using a sex demon to seduce her landlord's son. The supposed evidence? The boy confessed to dreams involving her sweet and fiery presence and said he felt pulled from his bed by invisible ropes. The woman was tried and horrifyingly executed, her only real crime being too close to someone's imagination. And imagination ran wild in this era. Erotic dreams were scrutinised, especially if they came with physical evidence: stained linen, flushed cheeks, an awkward shuffle the next morning. Some people confessed to years of demoniac visitation, insisting they had resisted for as long as possible before finally giving in. Others used demon stories to explain desires that couldn't be spoken openly. Homosexuality, for instance, was often rebranded as unnatural temptation, possibly implanted by a demon. It was safer than admitting real attraction, which could lead to torture or death. But the line between belief and excuse was blurry. Did people truly believe they had slept with demons? Or were they trying to save themselves from shame, sin, or punishment? Scholars are still debating this. Some suggest these tales were sincere, a product of a culture that viewed the world as a battleground between divine and infernal forces. Others argue these stories were tools, narratives people leaned on when they'd done something they weren't supposed to and needed a way out. And it wasn't just the church spreading these ideas. Physicians got involved too. Medieval medical texts describe cases of nocturnal emissions, blamed on succubi, and treatments often involve fasting, bloodletting, or the application of cold compresses, usually to the head, though you can imagine where they were tempted to place them. There were herbal remedies to suppress desire, instructions to avoid sleeping on your back, lest demons mistake you for someone inviting. One English physician even recommended sleeping with a crucifix sewn into your nightcap, fashionable and defensive. You sit now by the dying fire, the friar's story endings with a warning: guard your bed, lest a shadow take your warmth and leave you cold forever. The crowd murmurs, some crossing themselves, others laughing nervously. But you can feel it, the tension under the skin, the half-belief in a world where not everything that happens at night can be blamed on human weakness. Because in a time where walls were thin, privacy rare, and repression thick as porridge, maybe it was easier to believe in a devil at your door than to admit that your own heart had needs, loud, messy, inconvenient ones. And maybe, just maybe, those stories gave people room to feel shame without being ruined by it. A lie, yes, but a very useful one. You're crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, fingers cold and chalky with dust, your breath held as footsteps pass by. Just above your head, tucked into a crack between two bricks, is a folded scrap of parchment, dry, creased, and dangerously fragile. It's been hidden here for who knows how long, tucked away by a hand that shook with either excitement or fear. You unfold it gently, and there it is, a letter, a confession, a plea, maybe a curse. The ink is faded, but the meaning is clear. I wait for you by the orchard wall, after vespers. No one must know. In a world where privacy was scarce and surveillance was mostly social, written words became both lifeline and liability. Love letters in medieval times weren't just sentimental, they were risky, subversive, and sometimes criminal. But still, people wrote them, tucked into prayer books, slipped into cloaks, hidden in baskets of bread or buried in walls. Each one a dangerous act of longing in a culture obsessed with watching, knowing, and controlling what you did with your heart and your body. Let's start with the basics. Writing wasn't a universal skill. Many peasants were illiterate, and even among the literate classes, writing was laborious. Ink and parchment weren't cheap, and pens had to be hand-cut from quills. So writing a letter, especially one about love, was an intentional act. It required resources, time, and usually secrecy. If you were noble or wealthy, you might have a private tutor or clerk who taught you the craft. If you were poor, maybe you dictated your feelings to a trusted friend or scribe. Either way, it was never just jotting something down. Now imagine writing something as scandalous as I burn for you. Or, last night's dream was too much to bear. Or, your husband leaves at dusk. I will wait in the barn. These aren't simple notes. There are confessions of intent, sometimes even evidence of a crime. If intercepted, they could be used against you in court and confession or at the local pillory. And yet medieval people wrote these letters all the time. We know this because hundreds of them survive, tucked into manuscripts, scribbled in the margins of religious texts, preserved in court records as evidence, or found hidden in household walls during later renovations. One particularly infamous letter comes from 14th century France, where a noblewoman wrote to her lover, My eyes pretend to see only the altar, but in truth they follow you. The letter was discovered by a jealous servant and turned over to her husband. The lover was exiled. The woman was sent to a convent. The letter itself was copied and passed around among the household for amusement. Romance ruined by bad hiding and worse luck. But not all letters were discovered. Many survived because the people exchanging them were careful, even brilliant, about how they did it. Some used codes, simple ones like swapping vowels, or complex ones like replacing entire words with Latin phrases. Others wrote in the form of religious prayers, using piety as a disguise for passion. "I long to kneel beside you in devotion," one man wrote in the margins of a psalter. The monk who later found it noted, somewhat dryly, "This prayer seems to have two meanings." Letters often relied on messengers, servants, friends, or bribed children. These go-betweens played a vital role in keeping love alive across castle walls and social divides, but they were also a risk. A servant might grow jealous. A child might speak too loudly. One slip and your secret became town gossip, and gossip in the medieval world was as dangerous as a sword. There's a fringe tale from the Rhineland about a widow and a merchant who carried on a 10-year affair entirely through letters. They only met face-to-face a handful of times, mostly by accident. Their correspondence found decades later in a hidden box behind a fireplace is filled with longing, clever wordplay and detailed fantasies. One letter ends with, "If love must be silent, let my ink be loud." Historians still debate whether the story is real or romanticised, but the letters are real enough, preserved now in a library under layers of glass and humidity control. But not all letters were romantic. Some were vengeful. Scorned lovers wrote damning accusations. Wives wrote desperate pleas for rescue from forced marriages. One chilling letter, written by a girl barely 14, begged a local bishop to intervene before her wedding night. She claimed her intended was old, cruel, and already bragging about her obedience. Whether the letter reached him or not, no one knows, but the note survives, preserved in a bundle of church correspondences like a ghost between pages. Scholars today examine these letters with a mix of awe and sorrow. They're intimate windows into private lives we weren't supposed to see. Some are heartbreaking, others absurd. One knight wrote to a noble woman comparing her beauty to an eagle wrapped in honey. What does that even mean? We don't know. But the effort was there. The language of love, awkward, bold, poetic, clumsy, crossed centuries in ink. But these letters also reveal how deeply people craved connection in a world where bodies were rarely alone, but hearts often were. When you live in a household with 10 people and sleep beside your siblings, your thoughts become your only refuge. And putting those thoughts to paper, that's rebellion. That's bravery. You refold the parchment and slip it back into the wall crack, careful not to disturb the stone. Someone once risked everything to hide it there. Maybe they were never found out. Maybe they were, but their words lived. And in a world where privacy was rare and touch was surveilled, the written word offered something rare and precious. A secret that could speak when you could not. Because even if the walls had ears, sometimes they also held love letters. You're standing outside the apothecary's shop, hesitating just before the threshold. Inside it smells like vinegar and rosemary, with something darker beneath. A coppery tang that hints at blood and other unspoken things. Shelves line the walls, stacked with glass jars, dried roots, powders, and bundled herbs tied like tiny corpses. The door creaks as you step in, and the old woman behind the counter doesn't look up. She's grinding something into a paste, her hands stained from years of strange requests. You clear your throat. "I need something to protect me from touch." She nods, not needing details, because she's been hearing the same request all month. The plague has arrived, and no one dares to get close. It's hard to imagine a time more terrifying than the Black Death. Sweeping through Europe in waves from the 14th century onward, it killed tens of millions, sometimes a third of a town's population in a single summer. And with every new case came fear, suspicion, and total disruption of daily life. The streets emptied, the markets thinned, the bells rang more often than they didn't. And for all that death, something else withered too. Human closeness. Suddenly touch wasn't comfort, it was danger. The rules changed fast. People who once greeted each other with kisses on the cheek and hearty handshakes started crossing the street to avoid even eye contact. Neighbours became strangers. Lovers became dangerous. The idea of lying beside someone, breathing the same air, sweating under the same blanket, started to feel like volunteering for execution. And if your partner showed symptoms, a cough, a boil, a fever, it wasn't compassion that followed. It was distance, isolation, doors locked from the outside. Even the church, which once encouraged intimacy in marriage and communion through touch, grew cautious. Priests started hearing confessions from across the room, refusing last rites if someone looked too far gone. Monasteries closed their gates. Pilgrimages halted. The body, once central to rituals of love and worship, was now treated like a ticking bomb. This wasn't just fear of sickness. It was a total breakdown of trust in the physical world. And nowhere was that more apparent than in the bedroom. Couples, especially married ones, found themselves caught between obligation and self-preservation. Some continued to share beds, if only because space was limited, but many separated, choosing different corners of the house or even sleeping outdoors. Marital intimacy became both legally and emotionally fraught. There are accounts of women refusing their husbands' advances out of fear, and men accusing wives of withholding affection in the name of safety. One man in Florence even petitioned the city to grant him legal exemption from chastity because his wife wouldn't touch him, and he claimed it was unhealthy to go without. The city said no. His wife, they agreed, was just being smart. Meanwhile, the rules around what counted as unclean expanded. It wasn't just sex outside of marriage anymore. It was sex at all, if there was even a whisper of infection nearby. And the plague didn't need proof to make people paranoid. If your cousin's servant coughed near the well, you might avoid your own spouse for weeks. If a neighbour died, you slept in your boots with your back to the wall just in case. And then there were the beliefs. Theories about how the plague spread, many of them deeply wrong but widely followed. Some thought it came through bad air, so they burned herbs in the bedroom and covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar. Others blamed sin, especially sexual sin. The idea was that lust weakened the body and opened it to corruption. This wasn't just a church talking point. Doctors said it too. They wrote that sexual activity weakened the vital humours, making you vulnerable. So sex wasn't just risky because of proximity, it was biologically suspect. Of course, people still had sex. Even during the plague, desire didn't vanish. But it changed. It went underground. It became rushed, guilt-laced, desperate. Some saw the looming spectre of death and gave into impulse with a kind of reckless abandon. There's a fringe report from an English village where a woman was fined for having sex with a stranger during her husband's burial procession. True? Hard to say. But the story got repeated, and that tells you something. Others channeled their fear into strange rituals. Some wore talismans, others tried cleansing intercourse, where they believed sex with a virgin or a very young partner might absorb illness and purify the body. You don't need to think too hard to imagine where that led. To abuse, to exploitation, to pain disguised as medicine. In some cities, women were advised to avoid even talking to men during outbreaks, lest their hysteria be sparked and made worse by plague anxiety. And when people got sick, everything about the body changed. Boils, blackened skin, bloody coughs. There are love letters written during this time that read more like farewell notes. If I do not return, remember our night by the mill, or your breath was the last warmth I knew. Lovers kissed through cloth. Some met only once under cover of night, never to see each other again. A few chose to die together rather than part. Scholars argue whether the plague increased or decreased sexual activity in general. Some point to the burst of illegitimate births 9 months after outbreaks and argue that fear didn't stop desire, it intensified it. Others say abstinence rose sharply, especially among the devout. Monks and nuns who once confessed to impure dreams now doubled down on celibacy. For many, the plague was proof that the body was a trap, that the safest love was the one you imagined, not the one you touched. You step out of the apothecary clutching your little pouch of dried sage and cloves. The smell sharp and almost medicinal. The streets are quiet. A couple walks hand in hand, but they're masked, gloved, cautious. A young man sells charms carved from rowan wood, each one promising safety or strength or peace. You doubt any of it works, but you understand the need. When touch can kill, even pretending to be protected feels like power. And later that night, when the house is still and the windows are shuttered against the damp air, you lie awake wondering if the person beside you is breathing evenly. If they'll wake in the morning, if you will. You don't reach out, not yet, but maybe tomorrow. Because even in the shadow of death, the need for connection still lingers. It waits. And sometimes, despite everything, it wins. You're in the heart of the village square again, but tonight it's unrecognisable, alive with colour draped in ribbons, and humming with a different kind of energy. Music spills from every corner. Drums pound like heartbeats. Lanterns swing overhead, casting strange shadows across the faces of people who suddenly look unfamiliar. That's because they are wearing masks. Wooden, painted, feathered, some grotesque, some beautiful. You see a goat man dancing with a nun, a jester kissing a knight's armoured chest plate, and someone in a deer mask offering you a cup of wine with a wink. Welcome to Carnival, or Feast of Fools, or Shrovetide. Whatever they call it here, the meaning is the same. For one night the rules go out the window, and everything you're not supposed to do becomes irresistible. You feel it in the air, the reversal, the permission. Peasants wear crowns made of straw, nobles don rough wool tunics and walk barefoot through the mire. Women dress as men, and men as women. It's not just allowed, it's expected. Because this is misrule, this is sanctioned chaos, and under the cover of masks and music people indulge in more than just food and drink. They indulge in touch, in whispers, in glances that would be as scandalous any other night. Tonight, no one's watching, or if they are, they don't know who you are. Medieval festivals like this were both religious and wild, officially tied to the calendar, but unofficially tied to everything the church wanted people to repress. They came before fasting seasons like Lent or during harvest celebrations, giving people a last glorious gasp of indulgence before abstinence took over again. But more than that, these festivals functioned as a pressure valve. All the rules you'd followed all year, obedience, chastity, silence, were suddenly suspended. For a few hours you could become someone else, someone braver, louder, hungrier, and often someone more seductive. There are records, plenty of them, of babies born 9 months after festivals. That's not a coincidence. Sex during Carnival was common, expected, and often anonymous. Under a mask you could touch someone without knowing or needing to know their name. Some wore bells, others wore veils. One infamous report from Flanders tells of a festival where a group of women wore fox masks and lured men into hay wagons behind the tavern. When authorities arrived, no one confessed. No one knew who was who. Everyone just laughed, called it a prank and moved on. Of course, it wasn't always so light-hearted. The loosened rules could lead to real harm. Assaults, regrets, and the blurring of consent. Women who participated too boldly might later be called whores. Men who crossed class boundaries during the festivities sometimes paid dearly afterward. And if you happened to be queer, this might be the only night all year you could even pretend to live freely, before the masks came off and the world returned to its strict, punishing normal. Because that's the other truth of these festivals. They were temporary, deliberately so. The church allowed them not in spite of their chaos, but because of it. A few nights of madness kept the rest of the year manageable. Better to let people sin a little under the guise of mischief than risk full-blown rebellion. You could confess it all later. Pay a fine, say a prayer, go back to your carefully constructed life. But in the moment it was euphoric. You watch as a pair of masked dancers spin into the torchlight, clinging to each other in a way that's just on the edge of decency. A woman in a monk's robe pretends to give a sermon while her friend, dressed as the Virgin Mary, laughs so hard she nearly spills her drink. A boy chases a girl through a maze of hay bales, both shrieking with delight. And somewhere nearby, 2 people slip behind a cart with practised ease. They'll be back before midnight. Or maybe not. One fringe tale comes from a 15th century German village where a butcher's apprentice and a merchant's daughter met at a Shrovetide dance, both masked. They slept together behind the church. Months later they were married. They swore they hadn't known each other's identity that night. Their parents didn't believe them, but the village declared it a miracle, a love ordained by the misrule. The story lived on for years, told as both a warning and a celebration. And that's the strange power of these festivals. They blurred not just identities, but intentions. Was that kiss meant for you, or for your costume? Was that hand reaching out in passion, or just playing along with the madness? The masks offered freedom, but also danger. You could become someone else, but so could everyone else. Scholars have long debated the purpose of these celebrations. Were they tools of social control, letting people blow off steam so they wouldn't revolt later? Were they remnants of pagan traditions barely cloaked in Christian language? Or were they genuine expressions of joy, protest, and deeply human need? Probably all 3. What's clear is that they offered something rare in medieval life, a moment where desire didn't have to hide, where the body, so often burdened by rules and shame, could just exist, hungry, reckless, alive. As the night deepens and the music grows louder, you find yourself pulled into a dance. The person who takes your hand is wrapped in a wolf's pelt, eyes hidden behind black cloth. You don't speak, you don't need to. You move together, close, the fire casting long shadows as the crowd chants, sings, stomps. For a moment the whole world blurs into rhythm and sweat and laughter. And when the dance ends, you let go. Maybe you'll see them again tomorrow unmasked. Maybe not. That's the beauty and the risk of the festival. You don't always know what you've done until the sun rises, and even then you might pretend it was just a dream, a trick of the wine, a prank played by the gods of mischief. But you'll remember, because in a world that's always watching, always judging, there's something unforgettable about a night where no one knows who you are. And for once, it doesn't matter. You're standing in a strange little courtroom that smells like mildew and sheep, because, well, there are sheep. 3 of them, to be precise, listed and lined up like very confused defendants. One bleats, another scratches its hoof on the worn wooden floor, and across from them, arms crossed and face flushed, stands a furious farmer who insists that one of these animals was a witness to a crime. Not a murder, not a theft, a carnal sin. You glance at the judge, a tired man who's seen too much and is absolutely going to hear this out. Because in medieval Europe, animals sometimes stood trial, especially when it came to sex. Yes, really. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but animal trials were a documented reality in the Middle Ages and beyond. Pigs were hanged, goats were exiled, roosters were burned at the stake. Why? Because people believed that animals could not only witness sin, but also participate in it. And nothing terrified or fascinated the medieval mind more than the idea of unnatural sexual acts. When privacy didn't exist and gossip ran hotter than wildfire, even the suggestion of someone doing something inappropriate with a beast could lead to a full-blown scandal and yes, a courtroom drama where livestock played a starring role. You shift uncomfortably on the bench as the farmer presents his case. He claims that his neighbour, a labourer with unnaturally private habits, was seen late at night in the barn with one of the accused sheep. There were noises. There was movement. And the next morning the man walked out whistling. Suspicious. The farmer insists the sheep in question behaved ashamed, which frankly is not something anyone thought they'd hear before breakfast. Now, before we get too far, let's be clear. Most of these cases weren't actually about the animals. They were about human fear, social control, and the need to publicly mark the boundary between acceptable and forbidden. Sex with animals, what they called bestiality, was viewed as the ultimate perversion. Not just because of religious law, but because it blurred the fragile line between human and beast. That line, in medieval thought, was razor thin. People believed that a single lustful act could lower you below animals in the hierarchy of nature. And worse, it could change you. There were stories, deeply disturbing ones, of people turning into animals because of their sins, of children born with tails or fur or extra limbs as proof of their parents' transgressions. This wasn't fringe belief. It was mainstream theology mixed with folklore and a deep misunderstanding of biology. So when someone was accused of committing a sexual act with an animal, it wasn't just about shame, it was about contamination, a threat to the entire community. That's why the animal had to go on trial too. If a man was found guilty of bestiality, he was usually executed, often by hanging or burning. But the animal wasn't just slaughtered quietly. No, it had to be judged. Witnesses were called. Evidence was presented. Sometimes the animal had to stand beside the accused in court. One infamous case from 1386 in Falaise, France, involved a sow who was dressed in human clothes, paraded through the village square, and then publicly executed for allegedly knowing a man in the biblical sense. There are illustrations. They are as horrifying as they are surreal. But the logic, if you can call it that, was consistent. If the animal had consented, it was guilty. If it had been violated against its will, it was still seen as tainted. Either way, it had to be removed. Because even the suggestion that an animal had been part of an unspeakable act was enough to make it a threat to the moral and sometimes literal health of the community. This leads us to a wild, scholarly debate. Did these trials reflect genuine belief, or were they a way to perform moral outrage for an audience? Some historians argue that people truly believed animals could be corrupted by sin. Others suggest the trials were symbolic public rituals designed to reinforce taboo and provide a theatrical outlet for communal anxiety. Kind of like a passion play, but with more bleating and significantly more trauma. There's also a fringe theory that some of these cases were cover stories, accusations brought against poor or marginalised individuals as a way to exile or eliminate them. A farmer who owned too much land, or a widow who kept to herself, could be accused of inappropriate behaviour, and suddenly their sheep became a legal witness. The absurdity of the trial didn't matter. The verdict did. And don't forget, witnesses mattered. Medieval courts operated heavily on testimony. If 3 people said they saw something, anything that was often enough. If someone heard a grunt behind the stables and assumed the worst, well, that was a lead. If an animal reacted oddly around its owner, that was evidence. There are recorded instances where a dog's refusal to obey its master was cited as proof of guilt, which, given that dogs occasionally refuse to sit even today, is a deeply shaky foundation for execution. But it wasn't just about punishment. These trials had another purpose: to restore order. After the verdict, there might be a purification ritual, a blessing of the barn, prayers to cleanse the soil. The execution itself was sometimes accompanied by fasting, almsgiving, and public penance by the whole community. The message was clear: we will not let this filth infect us. And then everyone went home and hoped the sin stayed gone. As you watch the trial wind down, the judge strokes his beard and declares that no definitive guilt has been proven, but the sheep shall be sold and the barn cleansed by fire. The accused man leaves in disgrace. The sheep? Sold off to a village 3 miles away, as if changing pastures could undo the stain of suspicion. You watch it all, unsure whether you're witnessing justice or theatre, or both. And later that evening, as the sun sinks low over the fields and the barn still smoulders with the faint scent of burned straw, you think about the sheer absurdity of it all. That in a time when people had no privacy, where every act was observed, whispered about, and sometimes prosecuted, the only way to draw a line between human and beast was to put them both in the same courtroom. Because when everything about sexuality is tangled in fear and shame, sometimes it's easier to blame a goat than admit the truth about desire. You're slogging down a narrow, ankle-deep lane in the middle of town, your boots sticking to the mud with every step. Except it's not just mud, it's worse. Slick with waste, rotting vegetables, spoiled meat, and something you really, really hope is just a turnip gone sour. The air is thick with the stench of sewage, manure and smoke, and you gag a little as you pull your cloak tighter and keep moving. To your left, someone tosses a sloshing bucket out of an upstairs window without warning. You duck, barely missing a faceful of what they call night soil. This is medieval street life. Romantic encounters, sure, but they come with a heavy side of filth, discomfort, and deeply unsexy logistics. Despite what the paintings and modern costume dramas suggest, medieval people didn't wander around smelling like roses and having moonlit rendezvous on freshly trimmed lawns. They were often filthy, exhausted, and surrounded by the constant presence of livestock and waste, and yet somehow, in the middle of all that, they still managed to flirt, court, sneak kisses behind taverns, and even have sex in some of the worst-smelling places imaginable. Because where privacy didn't exist, sometimes the only chance to be alone was where no one else wanted to go. The alleyways were dark, the stables were convenient, the corners behind the baker's oven were warm, the haylofts above barns, especially in winter, were practically invitation only. And public latrines? Yes, even those became rendezvous spots for desperate lovers. Not because it was romantic, because it was hidden, or at least hidden enough to pass for privacy, in a world where most houses had open rafters and shared beds. And let's not forget the taverns. The local alehouse wasn't just for drinks and dice. It was where people met, flirted, and sometimes found themselves groping under the table before stumbling outside for a quick, breathless tumble behind the barrels. The floor was sticky, the smell was sour. But when you're 3 mugs in and the stars are bright overhead, your standards start to wobble. But the consequences of these rushed, unhygienic trysts weren't just a matter of gossip. They could lead to real medical issues. Infections weren't well understood, and there was little concept of bacteria or proper sanitation. A splinter from a hayloft floor could turn into a festering wound. A scrape from a stone wall might be misdiagnosed as a curse. And the risk of pregnancy, especially for unmarried women, was constant, terrifying, and often handled by the very same apothecaries who sold herbal contraceptives under codenames like Moon Tea or Bishop's Blessing. There's a wonderfully strange fringe record from a port town in Ireland where a young man, having been caught with the blacksmith's daughter behind the fish market, defended himself by claiming he slipped into her. That's the entire defence. The magistrate rolled his eyes so hard it was noted in the margin of the court record. He was fined, and she was sent to live with an aunt in the countryside, presumably until things settled down. Whether they ever saw each other again is unknown, but the smell of fish might have ruined the whole thing anyway. The point is, medieval sex wasn't candle-lit and perfumed. It was noisy, awkward, hurried, and often took place near steaming piles of refuse, or within earshot of someone chopping turnips. Yet people pursued it, not just because of desire, but because, in a weird way, the very lack of privacy created a kind of intimacy. You didn't expect perfection. You weren't waiting for silence and silk sheets. You were stealing moments in a world that didn't want you to have any. Even within the home, the options weren't great. A thatched roof dripped, rats scurried in the corners, the dog snored at your feet. You might be sharing your straw mattress with your younger siblings or a distant cousin. The idea of setting the mood was laughable. More often you were just trying to avoid eye contact with the guy picking his toenails across the room. And the smells? They never went away. If someone had a strong perfume, it wasn't for fashion. It was to cover the reek. Sage, lavender, rosemary, used not in delicate spritzes, but soaked into cloth and stuffed under armpits. You might tuck a sprig of mint behind your ear before a date, hoping it made up for the fact that you hadn't bathed in a week. Hygiene was effortful, inconsistent, and entirely dependent on your social class and your proximity to clean water. That said, medieval people weren't totally oblivious to the grossness. They complained about the smells too. City councils passed ordinances banning the dumping of chamber pots into the street, though people mostly ignored them. One English town tried to create designated love booths for couples who wanted privacy. They lasted less than a month before being shut down due to unruliness. Translation: it got weird. Still, there were moments of beauty. A kiss stolen under a crumbling archway, fingers brushing in the market as two lovers passed each other, vegetables and coded messages, a shared cloak in the cold, your breath mixing with theirs under the moon. Even if the ground squelched beneath you and someone nearby was loudly vomiting mead, the feeling of intimacy was real. And that's the key. Love, like sewage, always found a way. Scholars argue about whether medieval people had lower standards for cleanliness or simply adjusted to the constant funk of their environment. Some say they didn't notice it. Others say they complained about it endlessly, but learned to live with it. What's certain is that they still crave connection, even if it came with mud, sweat, and the occasional rat sprinting across the rafters. You pull your hood tighter, skirting a puddle that looks disturbingly sentient. Around the corner you spot two figures pressed close together in the shadows, whispering and laughing. It's not a good place. It's cold, it's foul, but it's theirs. A moment carved out of a world that never stops watching, never stops stinking, never gives you the time or space to just be with someone. And for that couple right now, nothing else matters. You're seated in the back of a dusty hall where sunlight slants through slatted shutters, dust motes swirling in the haze like drifting ghosts. At the front of the room, a man in worn clerical robes lifts a heavy iron object onto the table. It clinks dully, catching the light, a curious contraption of rusted metal and leather straps. Whispers ripple through the gathered crowd, most of them schoolboys and tradesmen here to be warned, scared straight, or maybe just amused. You lean forward. It's exactly what you think it is, a chastity belt, or at least someone says it is. Few objects capture the imagination of the Middle Ages quite like the chastity belt. That locked, armoured undergarment supposedly used to control women's sexuality, complete with a key held by a suspicious husband or an anxious father. The idea is everywhere, in medieval jokes, Victorian engravings, bad history memes, and awkward novelty gifts sold in modern tourist shops. But was it real? Sort of. Maybe kind of. This is one of those historical grey areas where myth and truth have been tangled together for centuries and no one can quite remember how the knot started. Let's begin with the legend. According to popular lore, crusaders heading off to fight in the Holy Land would lock up their wives or daughters in iron underpants to ensure fidelity while they were away for years. The key would hang on a chain around their neck or be entrusted to a servant sworn to secrecy. It's an image that blends male paranoia with medieval engineering, painfully literally. But here's the thing. no actual evidence supports widespread use of chastity belts in the medieval period, at least not for what we think. Most surviving chastity belts in museums date from the 16th century and later, and many are almost certainly fakes or misunderstood devices. Some were created as gag gifts, visual metaphors or moral warnings. Others were used in medical contexts, designed to prevent masturbation or discourage sexual behaviour in institutional settings. But as for iron underwear being worn around the clock by actual medieval women, highly unlikely. The logistics alone are mind-numbing. For starters, hygiene. Medieval people weren't exactly rolling in soap and sterile water. Wearing a metal device around the groin for weeks or months would have led to infection, sores, and all manner of horrifying health issues. Plus, these belts often lacked anything resembling comfort. No padding, no room for movement, no accommodations for basic bodily functions. The designs we do see are more theatrical than practical, suggesting that their purpose was symbolic, not literal. Still, the idea of the chastity belt stuck. Why? Because it tapped into something deeply medieval, the obsession with control. More specifically, the control of women's bodies. Whether the belts were real or not, the fantasy of them fed into the broader structure of how society tried to govern female sexuality. You didn't need an iron cage if you had surveillance, threats, and public shame. In other words, a metaphorical chastity belt was already wrapped around most women the moment they reached puberty. Girls were taught early that their value was directly tied to their purity. Songs, sermons, and bedtime stories all reinforced the same message. A locked body meant a worthy woman. Virginity was your dowry, your shield, your bargaining chip. Lose it before marriage and you risked everything, your name and your future, your family's standing. That pressure didn't require metal. It was psychological, social, and often enforced by other women as much as by men. Still, chastity belts showed up in art and literature with increasing frequency as the centuries progressed. Satirical poems from the 15th century describe jealous husbands fitting their wives with iron blooms and padlocks blessed by the bishop himself. There's a fringe tale from Florence where a merchant claimed to have designed a belt with a lock so complex that only he could open it, until he lost the key in a flood and had to call a locksmith. The local priest refused to bless the reunion. These stories, whether exaggerated or fictional, reveal the anxiety bubbling beneath them. Not just about fidelity, but about access, about ownership, about the unbearable fear that someone, somewhere, might touch what you believe belongs to you. The chastity belt was a symbol of that fear, a crude, literal manifestation of a cultural mindset. And what about the women? Historical records show that women pushed back. Some refused arranged marriages outright. Others eloped with lovers or fled to convents for protection. One noble woman accused of infidelity by her husband reportedly demanded a trial by midwife to prove her innocence, and when cleared, made him wear a belt he couldn't remove without her permission. It's unclear whether this actually happened or was just a delicious piece of anti-patriarchal gossip, but either way, it speaks volumes. There are also accounts of women making their own chastity devices, not to keep lovers out, but to ward off unwanted advances. In a time when sexual assault was common and rarely punished, some women supposedly fashioned crude girdles from leather or iron to protect themselves when travelling alone. Again, these stories blur the line between fact and survival myth. But they flip the narrative. Sometimes the belt wasn't about control, it was about defence. Scholars remain divided. Some argue that the chastity belt was an invention of later centuries, projected backward onto the Middle Ages by moralising Victorians who loved a good sexual panic. Others believe a handful of experimental versions may have existed, if only among the deeply paranoid and well-funded. Either way, what's undeniable is that the image endures. Something about the idea of physically locking sexuality away, making it visible, touchable, governable, never stopped fascinating us. You rise from the bench as the clerk covers the belt again, locking it in a box like it might still bite. The audience disperses, some laughing, others whispering. One boy mutters that his wife will wear one someday, and the older man beside him elbows him hard enough to make his ears ring. Outside, the sunlight feels warmer, safer, less metallic, but in your mind the image lingers, not because it was real, but because it almost didn't need to be. Because in a world where there were no locked doors, no private rooms, and no silence, the chastity belt became a kind of joke, but not a funny one. You're standing at the edge of the village green, watching as two women carry baskets of linens across the square. One's got her back straight and eyes focused ahead, lips tight like a trap waiting to spring. The other walks slower, her dress just a bit too snug, her hand resting on a curve that everyone's pretending not to notice, but they do notice. In fact, every head that turns, every raised eyebrow, every too quiet pause in conversation is focused on the same thing, the unmistakable swell beneath her apron. She's pregnant and not married. And in this town, that's more than a scandal. It's evidence. In a world where privacy is nearly non-existent, the body becomes a loud and unrelenting truth-teller. And few things spoke louder in the medieval world than a baby bump appearing on the wrong woman at the wrong time under the wrong circumstances. There was no hiding it, no careful phrasing or artful avoidance. Once your belly began to grow, it told everyone your secret, whether you were ready or not. Pregnancy became not just a physical condition, but a walking, breathing confession. That's because pregnancy, more than almost anything else, was the proof that sex had happened. In a society obsessed with sexual control, especially over women, that proof carried weight far beyond the obvious. It was legal, it was moral, it was social. For a married woman, it was a badge of success, the continuation of a household, a lineage, a property claim. For an unmarried woman, it was shame in full display, dragging behind her like a clanging bell. Unwed pregnancy triggered a cascade of consequences. You might be dragged before the local priest for questioning. Or worse, brought before the manorial court, where village elders would interrogate you in front of neighbours who already suspected. Sometimes you'd be asked to name the father, sometimes begged, sometimes coerced. If he was known and willing, a shotgun marriage could be arranged. If he denied it or had vanished, you were on your own, and everyone would know it. There's a case from 15th century Yorkshire where a young woman, 6 months along, was paraded through the village with her hair unbraided and barefoot. Punishment for fornication without contract. She was made to publicly beg for forgiveness, not just from the church, but from the entire community. Her child, once born, would be labelled Filius Nullius, the child of no one. That label stuck in law and in life, branding not just the mother, but the baby too. And yet not all pregnancies outside of marriage were treated equally. If the woman was of higher status, say, the daughter of a merchant or a minor noble, her family might go to great lengths to hide the evidence. Sent away to visit an aunt, she might quietly give birth in another town and return months later, slimmer with a newly adopted sibling. Or the baby would be left at a church doorstep, a practice as common as it was heartbreaking. These children often ended up in foundling hospitals or convent care, raised by nuns and labelled from birth as different. But among the peasantry there was no hiding. A pregnancy was a ticking clock, each passing week narrowing the window for secrecy. Neighbours noticed, midwives gossiped, markets buzzed, and there were no maternity gowns, just tighter laces and looser aprons, none of which could conceal the truth for long. The belly told its tale, and it didn't just expose scandal, it created legal opportunity. In some cases, a woman's pregnancy was used as leverage. If she accused a man of fathering her child and no one else could be blamed, he might be compelled to marry her or pay support, though what support meant varied wildly. It might be a sack of grain every month, or the occasional coin. In one rather bold case from Normandy, a woman demanded the father build her a new oven, as hers had been ruined by her misfortune. He complied. Of course, not all accusations were believed. Without modern testing, it was a matter of testimony and reputation. If the woman was known to be flirtatious, or if she'd been seen talking too long with multiple men, doubt cast shadows fast. And if she'd ever laughed too loudly, or worn a brighter colour, or danced too long at a festival, well, those were seen as signs too. There's even a record of a woman who, upon showing early signs of pregnancy, preemptively confessed to a priest in hopes that repentance would lessen her public punishment. Instead, the priest used her confession to alert the village council, and she was brought up on charges the next week. Her belly hadn't even fully shown yet, but her tears and her waistline did the talking. Sometimes, though, pregnancies were celebrated even when they weren't lawful. In close-knit communities, a popular young couple caught in the act might be gently nudged toward marriage, their indiscretion laughed off as youthful vigour. And if a widowed woman became pregnant soon after her husband's death, people might look the other way, especially if the timing could be finessed. But in all cases, the truth was this. A woman's body wasn't her own. It was watched, measured, interpreted, and when it changed, visibly, undeniably, it became public property. Advice would pour in. Older women might press their hands to her stomach uninvited, declaring the baby a boy or girl. Men might make jokes, or worse, propositions now that she was no longer untouched. The church would demand penance, the neighbours would demand silence, and through it all, the woman would carry not just a child, but the full weight of her community's morality. Scholars still debate whether these pregnancies were more common than we think, or whether they stood out so starkly precisely because they were rare. Some argue that many unwed pregnancies were quietly absorbed into the fabric of village life, especially in areas where courtship customs blurred the lines between betrothal and marriage. Others say the shame was so overwhelming that women often fled entirely, becoming labourers or servants in distant towns where no one asked questions. You watch as the two women with baskets pass by. The younger one walks with purpose, her chin high despite the whispers. The older one walks beside her like a shield, intercepting the glances. Neither speaks. They don't need to. The village will speak enough for them, because in the medieval world, your body wasn't a diary. It was a public document. And sometimes it told a story you hadn't even meant to write. You're crouched in the back pew of a chilly, candle-lit church, watching a man kneel before the altar with his head bowed and his hands clenched so tight his knuckles glow white. A priest stands over him, murmuring in Latin, occasionally nodding solemnly. You can't hear the confession itself. Thankfully, medieval churches had some sense of discretion. But judging by the man's body language, it's not about stolen bread or skipped mass. No, this one's heavy. Probably lust. Probably something worse. And it's not just about sin, it's about surveillance. Because in this world, even your most private desires weren't really yours. You couldn't whisper them, you couldn't write them, and you certainly couldn't act on them, not without someone watching. But here, in the confessional, you had to speak them aloud. Confession was one of the few semi-private moments available to people in the medieval world, but even then, it wasn't truly private. Starting in the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council made annual confession mandatory for every Christian. That meant once a year, you had to drag your sins out into the light. Splayed bare before a man who could forgive you, yes, but who might also judge you, counsel you, or even report you. It wasn't therapy, it was surveillance disguised as salvation, and nothing complicated confession quite like sex. The church had long maintained a sprawling, detailed list of sexual sins. These ranged from the expected, adultery, fornication, sodomy, to the weirdly specific. Position mattered, timing mattered, the day of the week, the location, the intent, even the thoughts you had during the act, all weighed against you. Did you enjoy it too much? Did you think of someone else while with your spouse? Did you lie with your wife during Lent? On a Sunday? On a feast day? If yes, sin, sin, sin. Penances varied. Light offences earned a few days of fasting, extra prayers, or a donation to the poor. Heavier ones, especially anything outside of marital, missionary position sex, might require months of abstinence, public acts of repentance, or prolonged shunning. And some sins, like homosexuality or bestiality, were considered not just mortal sins, but criminal acts, punishable by imprisonment, exile, or death. That meant confession wasn't just religious, it had legal teeth. And because of that, people learned to confess strategically. Some hedged their wording. I was tempted, they'd say, instead of I did it. Others confessed only what they thought the priest would expect. There's a known example from a 14th century English village where a man confessed to unspecified lewdness with a neighbour's daughter, then hastily added that it happened on a Wednesday, not Sunday, and that it was regrettably enjoyable. The priest recorded the confession, gave him a week of fasting, and asked follow-up questions for nearly half an hour. We know because the priest kept meticulous records. Yes, they wrote some of these down. Now imagine being a woman in that confessional, especially one with an unplanned pregnancy, a bruised heart, or a body marked by someone else's hands. Confession for women often became a delicate negotiation. Admit too much and risk harsh penance, or worse, public exposure. Admit too little and suffer the guilt of spiritual failure. Some women begged for mercy, others played dumb. One famous penitent claimed she lay with a man in spirit but not in the flesh, and insisted that surely spiritual intercourse was less damning. The priest disagreed. Fasting and silence were her sentence. The priest himself wasn't always neutral. Though bound by confidentiality, some were known to breach that trust, especially in small towns where everyone's business was already halfway known. A sinful confession might become sermon material, vaguely disguised. Or worse, it might spark rumours, especially if the priest was ambitious, nosy or vengeful. On occasion, confessions led to actual investigations, with clerics passing information to secular authorities. So much for sacred secrecy. Even worse, priests were men and not immune to temptation themselves. Some preyed on female penitents, leveraging their role as spiritual guide to become something far more sinister. There are records of priests seducing or coercing women during confession, offering lenient penance in exchange for physical favours. The Church, of course, condemned such acts, but justice was slow, uneven, and often non-existent. A woman who accused a priest had to risk everything: her word against his, her reputation against his collar, and then there were the manuals. Oh yes, confession guides, massive tomes written by clergy to help priests extract the necessary information. These weren't gentle, vague suggestions. They were exhaustive, anatomical, and honestly, kind of obsessive. They included long lists of questions priests were supposed to ask. Did the penitent engage in intercourse? How often? With whom? Where? Did they use unnatural means? Were animals involved? Were thoughts impure during otherwise lawful acts? It was like a medieval checklist for every possible form of physical transgression. Even if a sinner hadn't done something yet, reading that list might give them a few new ideas. Some scholars argue these manuals reveal more about the anxieties of the Church than the behaviour of ordinary people. Others point out that many penitents must have lied or deflected just to get through it. Because what kind of honesty is possible when the punishment for truth could destroy your life? Still, for some, confession was a relief, a pressure valve in a society that didn't let anyone speak their secrets aloud. Saying the sin out loud, no matter how whispered, no matter how dangerous, was the only place some people ever acknowledged who they really were. And if they got a priest who was kind, understanding, maybe even discreet, that rare moment of mercy could be life-altering. You watch as the man rises from his knees, his shoulders lighter. He bows and walks out slowly into the late afternoon light. The priest, for his part, doesn't pause. Another penitent is already waiting, an old woman with a hunched back and suspiciously red cheeks. He nods her forward. Behind them the candles keep burning. The silence between each whispered confession feels loaded, echoing against stone. This room has heard more secrets than any other place in the village. More confessions of lust, fear, longing, regret. It is the only place where sin is expected, where the unspeakable must be spoken. But even here, you're never really alone. The walls may not have ears, but the priest does. And in the medieval world, that was enough to make any secret tremble. You're walking across a quiet courtyard just after sunset, the last streaks of orange sky melting into a deepening blue, when you hear the gentle toll of a bell echo across the stones. It's soft, almost melancholy, calling the residents of this place not to dinner or to bed, but to silence. Because this isn't a village or a town, it's a monastery, a cloister, and here, behind high walls and heavy wooden doors, the world outside and all its carnal noise is kept firmly at bay, or at least that's the idea. You glance at the rows of shuttered windows, the quiet figures in brown robes moving between chapel and cell, and you wonder, how do people trained to kill desire actually live with it? Because contrary to the modern fantasy of serene monks and angelic nuns, calmly floating through life without a single dirty thought, the truth is far messier. Medieval religious life was built on the idea of spiritual purity, but its members were still human. They still had bodies, still had memories, still had dreams. And when you shut yourself off from the world in the name of holiness, sometimes those things don't go away. Sometimes they get louder. The rules were clear. For monks and nuns, sex was absolutely off limits. Not just in action, but in thought, in word, in gaze. Celibacy wasn't just a vow, it was a spiritual battlefield. Monks took oaths to God, pledging not to let lust corrupt their sacred routines. Nuns similarly were called brides of Christ, expected to live in chastity, devotion and strict obedience. Their bodies, once a concern of families and husbands, now belonged to the divine, but no vow could erase instinct. And the people who lived inside these walls, some willingly, others forced, struggled in all kinds of quiet, complicated ways. Let's start with the monks. Many entered the cloister young, sometimes as children, sometimes after a wild youth they hoped to escape. Monastic schedules were designed to wear the body down. Early prayers, hard labour, minimal food, long hours of quiet reflection. But the mind? It wandered. Despite all the fasting, flagellation and scripture, monks routinely wrote about their struggles with lust. Entire confessionals, journals and spiritual treatises survive, detailing their battles against the temptations of the flesh. Some monks wrote about erotic dreams, so vivid they woke up in a sweat. Others described moments of weakness when a visiting washerwoman exposed her ankle just a little too brazenly. One particularly honest friar wrote that his most persistent sin was imagining Mary Magdalene washing his feet, and then doing more. The admission earned him extra fasting, cold baths, and a stern letter from his superior. The thoughts never stopped. Nuns, too, weren't immune, and here's where things get especially murky, because while monks might confess their temptations freely, sometimes even boastfully, nuns were expected to maintain a deeper silence. Female purity was tied up in so many layers of fear, control, and mysticism that even acknowledging desire was considered dangerous. And yet, nuns left behind records, letters, marginalia, confessions, and secret poems, many of them remarkably frank. There's a well-known set of letters written by a 12th century French nun to her former lover, a theologian named Peter Abelard. Her name was Heloise, and her words are haunting. God knows, I would rather be your whore than his saint. These weren't the pious thoughts expected of a cloistered woman. They were bold, aching, and sensual. And they weren't alone. Other writings from convents, sometimes hidden in prayer books or scribbled in the margins of psalters, show that many nuns carried on inner lives rich with longing, memory, and in some cases secret relationships. Relationships between nuns. That happened too. Monastic rules forbade particular friendships, a vague but telling phrase used to discourage any one-on-one attachment that might become too intimate. And guess what? That phrase pops up a lot in visitations and disciplinary records, especially in convents. Punishments range from relocation to forced penance. But the friendships didn't always stop. In the quiet of the cloister, affection could blossom into love, and love could take forms the church had no language for, except condemnation. Scholars have been arguing for decades about how much sexual activity really happened behind cloistered doors. Some insist it was rare, exaggerated by gossip and anti-church satire. Others, reading between the lines of disciplinary records and private writings, suggest it was surprisingly common, especially in institutions where supervision was lax, or where power dynamics allowed certain members to act unchecked. And then there's the ongoing question. If two people fall in love but never act on it, is that a sin in a place where even thoughts can damn you? There's a fringe case from an Austrian abbey in the 14th century where a monk and a nun were found exchanging letters so carefully worded they could almost be mistaken for scripture. But between the prayers and metaphors the longing was clear. He wrote of her hair like a halo of wheat in summer, and she of his voice being the bell that woke my soul. When the letters were discovered he was transferred. She was locked in solitary penance for a year. The letters burned. But not before someone copied them, of course. Even in their dreams, monks and nuns were monitored. Erotic dreams were seen as a kind of spiritual weakness, possibly even the work of demons. So some religious men and women took to sleeping on stone floors or wearing hair shirts to punish their bodies. Others refused to sleep at all. Sleep, after all, was when your defences were down, when your body remembered things your soul tried to forget. But desire, when pushed underground, doesn't die. It tunnels. It finds cracks in the foundation, and sometimes it turns into something more dangerous. Obsession, guilt, or even cruelty. There are documented cases of monks becoming violent toward those who tempted them, as if punishing the source of their own failure could cleanse them of it. And there are tragic tales of nuns who, caught in forbidden love, were exiled, mutilated, or worse. You pause in the cloister's shadowed walkways, listening to the faint chant of Compline prayers echoing through the stone halls. The words are beautiful, ancient, designed to still the soul, but under them you can feel the quiet tremor of lives lived in tension, between flesh and spirit, between silence and scream, between the body's hunger and the mind's desperate effort to ignore it. In a world obsessed with controlling desire, the monastery was both refuge and prison, a place where people came to escape the noise of the outside world, only to discover that the loudest temptations were the ones inside themselves. You're sitting on the cold stone steps outside a village bathhouse just before dawn, your breath rising in lazy spirals as the sky lightens into grey. The building behind you is quiet now, steam no longer puffing from its little chimney, laughter long faded, only the faint dripping of water inside giving away its recent liveliness. What happened in there? More than bathing. Always more. because the medieval bathhouse wasn't just a place to get clean, it was a rare intersection of touch, talk, and transgression. In a world where people barely had private lives, these places offered something dangerously close. Bodily contact that wasn't work, and warmth that wasn't necessarily innocent. Bathhouses in the Middle Ages are one of those things that surprise people. The myth says no one bathed, just a constant parade of stink and dirt from cradle to grave, but that's not quite right. While it's true that bathing declined during certain plague years and fell out of fashion later in history, medieval towns, especially in places like Germany, Italy and parts of France, often had public bathhouses, places where men and women could scrub off the day, soak their bones, and often find a little intimacy while they were at it. Not all bathhouses were scandalous. Some really were about cleanliness and health. You'd go in, get rubbed down with soap root or scented oils, sit in a warm pool with your neighbours, and maybe have a bite of spiced bread afterward. For many it was a weekly ritual, social, communal, surprisingly wholesome. But then there were the others, the ones where the line between bathing and brothel blurred with every splash. These steam-filled dens weren't seedy shacks on the edge of town. They were sometimes right in the heart of it, with well-dressed attendants, music, refreshments, and plenty of private corners. Men and women bathed together in many places, especially before the 15th century, when stricter moral codes began cracking down. Mixed bathing meant relaxed bodies, shared wine, and lowered inhibitions. It was one of the few places where a carpenter might flirt with a merchant's wife, or a nun's runaway cousin might find herself soaking beside a young scribe with calloused hands and bad intentions. And of course, not all the attendees were there just for the hot water. Prostitution and bathhouses were deeply entwined in many cities. Some bathhouse workers offered special services along with towels and steam. Others worked as professional companions, talking, massaging, lounging beside customers in a way that was ambiguously erotic, even if it didn't end in sex. The term stew, often used to describe these bathhouses, eventually became slang for brothel. Not because of food, because things got hot and murky in there fast. This didn't go unnoticed. Local authorities tried to regulate them constantly, issuing ordinances about how many people could bathe together, banning shared towels, or requiring screens between tubs. Some cities forced women to wear bathrobes while soaking. Others outlawed all male or all female gatherings for fear of what might happen when supervision relaxed. Spoiler: the laws didn't work. People either ignored them or got clever. After all, when was the last time steam and hormones obeyed city council? There's a fringe tale from Prague where a wealthy widow supposedly built a virtuous bathhouse for women only, complete with a chapel attached. Within a month it had become the most talked about building in town, not for its piety, but for its late-night meetings and mystical massages. The widow insisted she was offering a service to improve health and community. The bishop called it a sinful lake of flesh. She closed it for exactly 1 day, then reopened under a new name and made twice as much money. But bathhouses weren't just sites of scandal, they were also meeting places. Lovers arranged secret rendezvous under the cover of community bathing. Spouses might escape prying family eyes for a quiet conversation behind the drying benches. Messages were passed, feet tangled underwater, and kisses stolen when the steam was thick and the candles low. In an age where nearly every interaction was supervised by family, neighbours, the church, bathhouses offered something rare, plausible deniability, an intimacy. Imagine this. You step into the dim heat, disrobe behind a modest screen, and slide into a tub already half occupied by a familiar silhouette. You're not speaking yet, just breathing the same damp air. Their knee brushes yours. A small bowl of wine is passed between you, sipped without eye contact. You can't touch much, but you can touch enough. A hand on a shoulder, a shared cloth, maybe just a whispered word swallowed by the steam. You don't need to imagine the rest, because in this world, people didn't wait for candles and clean linen. They made do. They found warmth where they could, even if it came with risk. Of course, as morality campaigns intensified, especially after the Black Death, many bathhouses were shut down or forced into stricter codes. Some towns declared them breeding grounds for sin and disease. Others tried to keep them purely medicinal. By the end of the medieval period, in many places, they had lost their sensual edge and become something colder, more controlled, less human. Scholars today still debate how common the more erotic side of bathhouses really was. Some argue that most people went just to wash, others insist that the bathhouse was one of the few places where sexual and social boundaries relaxed enough for something real and transgressive to happen. It probably varied, city to city, house to house, tub to tub. But you sit now on the worn step outside, your fingers tracing the grooves in the stone where countless others have waited. For a bath, for a meeting, for a chance. In a world so starved for private moments, even a little space behind a curtain, a flicker of shared heat, could bloom into something unforgettable. Because here, unlike almost anywhere else in the medieval world, you could let your guard down. For an hour, for a moment, for a touch. And that was worth the steam. So here you are, stretched out under your blanket, the hum of your fan soft in the background, the shadows in your room still and quiet. After everything you've seen tonight, goat trials, hayloft hookups, monastery scandals, and awkward bathhouse flings, it's a miracle you're still emotionally intact. Maybe a little unsettled, maybe laughing, maybe a bit grateful for doors that lock and walls that muffle. Because if there's one thing medieval life taught us, it's that intimacy back then wasn't soft focus or candlelit. It was raw, risky, tangled in rules and mud and judgment. And somehow people still found ways to love, to want, to sneak. You followed them through alleys and festivals, churches and plague years, across whispered letters and dripping rooftops. You've seen how bodies were watched, how desire was boxed in, how even a glance could become a scandal. And yet desire didn't vanish. It never does. It just shifted. It survived. In a world that rarely offered privacy, people made it where they could. Behind a stable, beneath a veil, inside a prayer, or tucked in the folds of a forbidden letter. So if your bed feels a little softer now, your life a little more peaceful, good, you've earned that. Let your own little corner of the world stay quiet tonight. No gossiping neighbours, no stern-faced priest, no goat on trial outside your window, just you, warm and relaxed, knowing that history is full of mess and miracles, and that somehow, in all the noise and rules and nonsense, people still found ways to touch each other's lives. Now close your eyes, let the old world fade.